Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is the fourth episode of the story that tells of what if were the second Shinobi World War left Yuzu destroyed out of fear. Its inhabitants were left slaughtered or scattered. However, what if the members of Uzushio's famed Uzumaki weren't as scattered as people thought? What would it mean for one Uzumaki Naruto? After watching, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin. Day 1, Night. Oh, for crying out loud. What is it now? In Kakashi's defense, he had been afraid of this for the seventh time since they'd begun on their journey. Kimiko had made it a point to single out each and every minute detail she found issue with in his handling of the genin. He swore, if it wasn't for the fact that she was both hot and an ally, he'd have chidoried her on the spot. Already, Kimiko had attacked their wardrobe okay, so maybe she had a point on that one due to the fact that, as she pointed out, the more obvious Tazuna's escort, the more valuable he'd seemed to bandits. Then she'd pointed out that an overland trip was ridiculously convoluted, as there were more than a few shipping lanes that would get them to wave in half the time for some strange reason. Tazuna had been adamantly opposed to that option, despite his obvious haste in wanting to finish building his super bridge, as he called it. Then there was his choice of reading material okay, so maybe he got that particular critique every time he read Ika near women and his lackadaisical attitude towards the genin's training, since they only got a few exercises in every day. There were a few more, naturally, but these were the ones that grated on his nerves the most, and now, despite having forced his team to change clothes to something more inconspicuous, including having his beloved mask hidden behind a scraggly scarf, despite having changed their route to a more direct one, despite pressing on his genin a bit more every day in training, she was again going to criticize something. Kimiko frowned as she held out a bowl to him, sitting next to him around the campfire for the night. "Your meal, Hataki-san," she stated in a clipped tone, obviously offended by his outburst. Kakashi stared at her for a moment, his hands frozen in the act of wild gesticulation as the wind in his anger was suddenly gone. "Oh," he said simply, concealing his embarrassment easily as he took the proffered bowl. "Thanks." She grunted noncommittally before offering the quiet Hinata a bowl of stew as well, which the shy girl gratefully took with a whispered thank you. Across the fire, Kakashi saw Tazuna and Hikari having a blast as they swapped stories regarding their experiences with public intoxication. "I swear I'm telling the truth," the old man said. "So me and Nobu, we're, still trying to figure out how we ended up in the middle of the temple grounds, him in a towel and me with just my pants on, when the last old man barges in, super pissed off like no other, swearing to neuter us with his butcher's axe," he recounted in between laughs. "Oh man, you should have seen his face. Bright red, like a tomato." Kiba stared at Tazuna in awe, as did Naruto. "So what happened next?" "Oh, well, the temple's head monk, this old, senile guy, ends up thinking they're under attack or some crap like that, so he attacks the girl's dad while we made a run for it. Anyway, mid-escape we sort of run into the village chief, one of those super pompous, fat bastard types, just as the butcher nearly catches us, and end up running him over and smashing his family jewels by accident." Tazuna reminisced with a grin. "And that's pretty much how I got banned from Yugakure." "All this over a girl?" Naruto asked, starry-eyed as Tazuna recounted his mischievous younger days. To Tazuna's other side, Hikari was struggling to keep herself upright as she howled with laughter. Tazuna grinned as he took a swig from his bottle. "Best stories usually are, boyo," he told Naruto with a smirk. "You'll find out when you grow up." Both Kiba and Naruto stared at him incredulously, causing Hikari and Tazuna to laugh even harder. Back on the other side of the campfire, Kakashi and Kimiko sat in tense silence as they observed the others in their group interact. Kakashi, for his part, was glad to see the tension amongst most of his group to have vanished after the first few hours of tense silence, but found Tazuna an odd duck. Despite his current boisterous, happy-go-lucky self, he'd been moody, tense, and obstinate when they'd first set out. Getting him to change his route, however minutely, had been a chore and a half, until Hikari had pulled him aside and spoken quietly with him. When they'd come back, Tazuna had been much more pliable, making Kakashi worry that Hikari had somehow put a seal on him or used genjutsu, but a quick release technique, out of sight and hearing of everyone, quickly disproved that theory. He's hiding something. Kakashi wasn't surprised at all that Kimiko had caught onto that fact. From what he knew of her, she was one of the Uzumaki's most experienced members, despite her age, which, while it still paled in comparison to his own battlefield experience, meant she was well versed, at least, in picking up on tells. He grunted noncommittally. Unless it's a security risk, not our problem. Kimiko frowned, apparently her default state of being, from what Kakashi could see. How do you know it's not? You're being surprisingly frivolous regarding your client's lies, Hataki-san. Kakashi shrugged as he contemplated the bowl of stew in his hands. For all I know, he wants to hide the fact that he owes some people money in one of the ports we mentioned, or some girl he forgot to write to and wants to avoid, he noted reasonably as he stirred the hot stew. And I can't just accuse him of hiding something without proof, and we already took the job. It'd make Konoha, and more importantly, all of us look bad if it ends up being an empty gesture. Kimiko grunted and looked away for a moment, not wanting to snap at the lazy jounin. When she turned back, her temper under tenuous rain, her eyes widened a bit as she noted that his bowl was now empty and he was just finishing tugging his mask back into place. How had he done that? She hadn't even taken 5 seconds. Trade secret, he preempted her with a smile and a thumbs up. Kimiko gaped for a moment before glaring at him and turning away. Still, she wasn't quite willing to drop the issue. I still say we should question him, she insisted stubbornly. And I'll remind you that you're here to watch Naruto, Kakashi rebutted mildly. You're not an actual member of this team, nor do you outrank me. Therefore, we're leaving the client alone and that's final. He then suddenly had a hand on her lap, just as her fists began to curl and tighten. And unless you want to cause a very public scene in front of your future clan head and kinsman, as well as 3 other witnesses, I'd keep that temper in check, he added in the same mild tone, smiling at Hinata when the heiress glanced towards them. She blushed upon making eye contact and quickly returned her attention to the amusing stories Tazuna and Hikari were exchanging. Kimiko's teeth were grating against each other as she realized he had her in checkmate at this point. Still, she had a point to make. Fine, Hataki, she conceded. But mark my words, if anything happens to the Tasha Koho, if I let anything happen to Naruto on my watch, I'll take my own life before you even get your weapon out, Kakashi told her grimly, without an inch of doubt. That firmness surprised her, as she'd expected him to assure her that nothing would happen. In fact, she couldn't really reconcile his layabout personality with his words, so she frowned as she pondered the odds of him being coy with her. Was he fibbing, or was he really being honest? Laughter from across their campfire drew her attention to her clansmen and the others in this misfit group. She couldn't believe how easy they were taking this mission, compared to her own professionalism. Heck, the only traps around the campsite were those Kakashi and she had set up, independently of each other. She frowned as Naruto and Kiba tried to wrestle each other following an argument over who'd won more matches between themselves, much to the amusement of Hikari, who cheered Naruto on, the embarrassment of Hinata, who seemed torn between watching and wanting to separate the two, and what seemed like melancholy from Tazuna. Why couldn't they act more like the shinobi they were rather than as a bunch of kids? Making to stand up, ready to discipline the two, she was suddenly stopped by Kakashi's hand on her back. Leave it, he advised. You were right before, about our clothes. The more obvious it is that we're ninja, the more valuable a target Tazuna becomes. If anyone stumbles upon us right now, all they'd see is a family having dinner and messing around, not a group of ninjas and their client. Her frown deepened. This is unbecoming of Shinobi, though, she snapped at him in a hissed tone. Perfect. Then no one should be paying attention to us, Kakashi said with a smile that didn't quite seem to reach his eye. Day 2, afternoon. Despite Tazuna's anxious protests, the group took a break the next day, having decided that if they were going to keep their civilian covers intact, they had to make it look the part. And with 3 kids around, No one was going to believe the group could march their way to wave without frequently stopping. They even went through the motions of setting up a decent campsite again, with Kakashi ostensibly going off for firewood while, in reality, he was scouting the perimeter for bandits, or worse, Hikari and Hinata laying out the packaged food they were planning to cook, with Hinata discreetly using bursts of Byakugan to scout the immediate vicinity, Kiba and Naruto horsing around near Tazuna, in reality, keeping a close eye on him, in case they got surprise attacked, and Kamiko gathering stones to put around the campfire, all the while thinking of the innumerable ways she could skewer Kakashi, no doubt. Of course, setting up such an obvious campsite was anathema to the shinobi, and while they were each well trained to dissimulate their discomfort, there were still signs to be observed, if one looked hard enough. Kakashi was too casual in his picking up firewood. Naruto and Kiba were too tense even as they played. Hinata's smile was strained at times, even though Hikari was doing a good job of keeping her relaxed with amusing stories, and Kamiko was always scowling intermittently, her eyes darting to and fro whenever the slightest sound resounded. Tazuna might not have been shinobi, but he'd been around people too afraid to speak up as to have learned some body reading. "You guys seem a little super tense," Tazuna noted as he took a swig of his booze bottle while they sat and ate. Kakashi chuckled as he watched his team, client, and unwanted extras go at their meal, his own already lying finished next to him. "That obvious, were we?" "Probably not, but I've been around enough people to know a tell when I see one," he answered noncommittally. Sorry, Kakashi apologized. "It's just that we're not used to going at this slow." "We are." Hikari intervened brightly with a smile and a raised fist. "My point exactly," Kakashi noted dryly as Tazuna eyed the cute redhead in confusion. "You've been trained in this sort of dissimulation, but it's never been a big part of our curriculum." Kimiko snorted, while Hikari ignored her, smiling brightly as she rubbed the back of her head. "You're missing out, then," she said. "Camping out civvy style used to be one of my favorite exercises ever." "Why's that?" Kiba asked through a mouthful, earning himself a reproachful glance from Hinata, just before she blushed furiously and returned her attention back to her own food shyly. To be fair to the Inuzuka heir, however, camping out was one of the most basic and dull exercises in Konoha, albeit they did it with basic ninja gear. Something changed in Hikari's bright expression, then, as her smile became more melancholic, her hands cradling the bowl of stew on her lap. "'Cause when we did it, we could pretend we weren't being hunted," she said softly. "We were just kids, camping it out with friends." An awkward silence descended on the group then, as Hikari's reminiscing reminded them of the Uzumaki's rather tragic past. It was just as quickly blown away, however, when the pigtailed girl grinned suddenly and rubbed her fist on Naruto's head. "Course, now I can do it all the time without worrying so much," she reminded the group, even as she ignored Naruto's indignant yelling as she noogied him. Tazuna chuckled despite himself as he watched the two fool around. To his mind's eye, you could have mistaken the two for siblings, though he supposed the fact that they were cousins was close enough. Thinking back on his own circumstances, the old bridge builder couldn't help but sigh as he wondered when he'd last seen such youthful vigor before him. His hometown was nowhere near like that anymore, not since he shook his head, refusing to ponder any further on the matter, lest he give himself away. While he hated lying to these children and their handlers, he'd had to. He was desperate, and any ninja was better than none in this particular situation. Even if that meant having these children around. Eyeing the older shinobi, he tried to convince himself that maybe things wouldn't be so bad, seeing as he was sure the older three wouldn't ever let anything happen to their wards. Day 7, evening. They'd reached a village this time around, and despite the occasional gloom caused by Tazuna's secretive apprehension or Hikari's reminiscing, the group managed to reach their next leg of the journey in relatively high spirits. Which, if one were totally honest, wasn't that hard when Naruto was around, given that practically nothing on this planet seemed to keep him down for longer than a few minutes. Well, other than Kamiko's stern warnings to act as befitting his exalted station. Even then, though, he was usually back to his exuberant self in seconds. Finding an inn wasn't much of an issue, thankfully, though Tazuna questioned the wisdom of staying the night in the village. Kakashi, for once, actually agreed with Kimiko that not staying in the village would probably arouse more suspicion and attention than if they just rested at the inn for the night. Especially when there were children in the group. Might have confused the adults for slavers, or something. In any case, splitting the rooms was pretty simple. The guys in one room, the girls in the other. Between Kimiko, Hikari, and Hinata, Kakashi had little worries that anyone with any sort of dastardly designs on them would end up 6 feet under, if only because the first two were, as far as he knew, considered powerful enough to be the clan leader's escort. If anything, he was more worried about his room's charges. Naruto and Kiba might have improved tons since he'd first met them, but they were still just genin. Zero field combat experience, Mizuki incident aside, and a limited array of techniques. Worse still, Tazuna was just a cranky old man with a booze habit and a decent talent at carpentry. If a fight broke out with any sort of opponent tougher than a low-level chunin, Kakashi was pretty much on his own, and he knew it. He watched as Kiba and Naruto wrestled in amidst their futons playfully, apparently trying to figure out who was the best between the two. Again. It was a never-ending contest, but Kakashi had seen and heard the two interact long enough to know there was no real bite in their rivalry, nothing like what he sometimes saw in Sasuke's interactions with either of them. "I'll be back in a sec," he told Tazuna as he got up from his futon, tightened the obi around his yukata. No and patron would actually remain in their traveling clothes unless they had no change of clothes, after all, and wearing his shinobi gear would just give away the whole team, and walked out of the room, sliding the door shut behind him. He had a few signaling traps he wanted to set up outside the inn, just in case. But just as soon as he turned to walk down the hallway towards the front door, he was promptly met by Kimiko, whose own yukata seemed to struggle to adequately conceal the woman's considerable bust. Reining in his inner pervert heart, he nodded at her in silent greeting and made to walk by her. "We're being followed," she told him flatly, halting him just as he was about to pass by her. Kakashi sighed and stopped, turning his head to face Aseher, a frown on what remained unconcealed of his face. "You're sure?" he asked. He hadn't noticed anything concrete yet, though he'd had his suspicions. No trip, even one by a nondescript group like theirs, was as uneventful as theirs had been. Uzumaki are trained to notice tales since even before shinobi training, Kimiko answered simply, frowning right back at him. "I'm sure," she then amended reluctantly, looking away. "Then I suppose it's a good thing I was going out to set up some signaling traps," he told her. "Don't bother, Hikari already did," she informed him. "First thing we've done whenever we settle for the night," she added a bit smugly. Kakashi frowned at her. He hadn't known about that, and had even, in fact, spent some considerable time setting up traps at each of their campsites to warn him of any possible intruders. And now she told him they'd preempted him each time? That he could have just sat back and read his damn book? Not cool. "Bandits?" he asked, choosing to keep the peace and not bring up his wasted time. She shook her head, to his inner dismay. "Too inconspicuous," she said, crossing her arms under her chest. "Shinobi, at the very least." "You or the client?" Kakashi followed up. It was a sobering question, but also a very understandable one. Now that 2 cells of the Uzumaki had publicly settled in Konoha after decades on the run, there was bound to be bounty hunters aiming to capture some of them and begrudged parties looking to settle some old scores. Kimiko realized this, but it didn't help her spiked anger as she snapped her gaze back at Kakashi and glared at him with all her might. "Don't." "No," she said through hissed teeth. "It's not like they told me they were there." "A fair point, altogether." Kakashi nodded in acquiescence and turned back towards his room. "All right, then I'm headed back to the client. Keep an eye out for our pursuers tomorrow. If we can catch one of them, we might get answers as to why we're being targeted." Kimiko kept her silent glare on him for a moment before reluctantly nodding. "Fine," she conceded. "Good evening." If Kakashi was surprised at the polite farewell, he didn't show it. Undoubtedly, Kimiko had been warned to play nice by her clan elders, and though she'd had a rough start, that standing order was beginning to seep through. Not that it seemed to save Naruto from her wrath, however, as she lost no opportunity to straighten him out whenever he acted outside her expectations. Which was amusingly quite often. Still, the one-eyed elite Jounin wondered on the Uzumaki once more. Undeniably, their arrival and settling in Konoha had certainly upped the village's military might, as well as given it not inconsiderable attention from less than savory elements. But none of that really mattered to Kakashi. He was more concerned with their effects on the actual inhabitants. The Nara clan had taken to the Uzumaki very warily, which was altogether not really a surprise. With its clan head a literal genius that far outstripped his own genius son in towering intellect, and a healthy dose of caution to mix things up, it was well within expectations that the Nara had chosen to approach the newcomers with a fair degree of apprehension. In fact, outside of the fun-loving and well-tempered Akimichi clan, the Nara state of mind seemed to permeate every other family's attitude as well. Not that it meant the Uzumaki were pariahs, of course. Despite the less-than-stellar treatment of their future clan head, the Uzumaki had done everything they could, short of giving away clan secrets, to ingratiate themselves with their hosts. The members within each of Konoha's military divisions all brought new techniques and paradigms that helped them make their divisions more efficient or less, in a rare case or two, usually regarding non-fuinjutsu techniques. But even with all the pros and cons weighed, Kakashi found himself simply unable to trust them as easily as the Sandaime had. They hadn't proved themselves loyal, and who was to say they wouldn't leave for better pastures elsewhere, if they felt slighted? Or worse, rebelled? He shivered as he returned to the boys' room and settled in for the night. What if they turned out another Itachi? Or worse, more than one? Could the village really afford another such betrayal? Could it really just afford to trust anyone who looked like they had good intentions? Sadly, as he regarded the sleeping form of Naruto, Kakashi didn't think so. Day 8, afternoon Shinobi liked to say they were sneaky, and that a shinobi attack always came unannounced. For the ambushers, however, such considerations were dead wrong. Apparently having failed to look up a proper forecast, or just not paying attention to the way the weather had been for the past few days, they'd opted to simulate a river flooding at a particularly critical crossing, no doubt hoping to divert the Konoha team to a more beneficial ambush spot. Yeah, that didn't work. Instead, Hikari had happily skipped on to the edge of the flooded riverbank, the battered remains of the former bridge a sad testament to the water's power, and then proceeded to summon a long, thick set of wooden planks, then kick them down, forming an impromptu bridge without any further hassle. Kakashi, never having seen summoning used in this particular way, had asked about the ready availability of wooden planks, to which Hikari had just smiled and said, "How else do you think the Uzumaki managed to build so quickly?" It made sense, in hindsight. Being rather nomadic in nature, it would make perfect sense for the Uzumaki clan to have supplies prepared and readily available for summoning at a moment's notice, allowing them to basically evacuate quickly and rebuild elsewhere without much fuss or exposure. Which was rather sad, in its own way, he supposed. In any case, it meant that the team, plus their client, managed to not come across any ambush at that particular spot, though the incident did serve to pique Kimiko and Kakashi's warning instincts, and further prove to Kakashi that Kimiko and Hikari hadn't been paranoid about being tailed. "I don't think it's us," Kimiko told him flatly as she and he hanged back from the group as they continued their travel. "Hikari, Naruto-sama, and I mean. If this was a snatch job or assassination towards members of the Uzumaki clan, they would have struck by now. Maybe they don't want to get caught," offered Kakashi lazily as he continued reading his book. "They'd probably want to avoid going toe-to-toe with Konoha." Kimiko frowned before grudgingly acceding to that. "Even so," she insisted, "it's more likely that our client is the target." Kakashi eyed the old man for a moment before returning to his book. "He's not really the type of guy you send professional assassins after, though." Kimiko's frown turned to a glare. "Then perhaps we should just ask our tails," she snapped, quickly looking away after her raised tone caught the rest of the group's attention. Hikari, in particular, had a knowing look as she glanced between the two. Everything all right? Kakashi waved lazily while Kamiko kept quiet, very stubbornly keeping her eyes averted from the group. It didn't take long for the children to get bored and resume their journey, followed quickly by the old man, though Hikari lagged behind maybe a second before shrugging at them and following the group. Left to themselves in reality, no more than a few feet away from the group, Kakashi and Kamiko allowed themselves to look at each other. Not a bad idea, Kakashi conceded as he resumed his march, Kamiko keeping pace with him. What isn't? Talking to our tails. I'm thinking bait. You or me? She asked. Both? Kamiko afforded a glance at the group in front of them. Her duty was to protect Naruto. Could she really afford playing around like this? On the other hand, she really wanted some answers that could, theoretically, inform her of any untoward threats towards her charge in the long run. Damn Kakashi and his plans. Fine. Day 9, afternoon. The opportunity to spring their trap didn't come until the next day, much to Kamiko's frustration and Kakashi's ambivalence. The pair of highly trained shinobi had been on the lookout for more inconsistencies in their surroundings, any hint whatsoever of enemy forces hiding out of sight, but had found nothing at all throughout the rest of the previous day. After turning in with a decidedly bad mood, Kamiko had insisted that she and Kakashi bring up the rear the next day, much to everyone's surprise. Naruto, however, had taken the announcement in stride, figuring that Kamiko just wanted to keep an eye on the group from a better vantage point, as was her nature. While Kiba was just as glad to return to his heated debate with Naruto regarding whether ramen or barbecued meat was better, Hinata's eyes lingered worriedly on the two Jonin-level ninjas before slowly returning her attention to the road ahead, as was her mission. Though that didn't stop her from occasionally glancing at Naruto. Hikari, for all intents and purposes, didn't seem to care as she exchanged drinking stories with Tazuna, who seemed grateful for the distraction from whatever it was that was eating at him. While not a heavy drinker herself, Hikari did know a few funny stories about her cousins, who were very prone to aggressive and idiotic behavior while under the influence. Suffice to say, Tazuna wondered how he'd be able to take her and her family seriously ever again. For the two shinobi at the back of the group, however, their attentions were fixed on their surroundings. Thus far, they hadn't detected their pursuers trying their hand again at an ambush, which worried Kakashi and Kamiko equally, as they doubted that a group persistent enough to bring down a bridge would so easily give up after a single foiled attempt. That moment came when the puddle came into view. Kakashi and Kamiko both smelled trap instantly, and from the way Hikari had tensed up a barely noticeable reflex, so had the younger Uzumaki clansmen. Only the three Genin and Tazuna remained oblivious to the puddle's significance. Only those four seemed to not realize that it hadn't rained in over a week. Hikari chanced to glance backwards at her cousin as she passed the puddle, as though asking permission to spring whatever trap they had just walked into. A barely noticeable shake of her head from Kamiko stopped her, however, and she smoothly sidled up closer to Naruto, ready to protect the future clan head with her life, if need be. Kamiko and Kakashi exchanged glances as they passed by the puddle. Were they sure about this? Could they really afford to gamble with the lives of their charges with this daring plan? Both were comfortably confident in their own abilities as warriors, but that only really applied to situations where they were soloing as part of a group. Could they really have the skills to protect everyone and still be effective? Both were gambling on yes. The two Jonin-level shinobi took 1 step, 2-3 steps past the puddle, and instantly felt the chakra flare behind them. They were ready. A chain, riddled with razor-like talons all along its length, came into view, just as they finished molding their chakra. They both allowed the chain to wrap itself around them, the talons biting superficially into their skin, which they made a good show of feeling hurt by, and just as their attackers began to speak, readied the substitution technique. 2 down, someone hissed sibilantly. The moment they felt the chain tug, they were gone. Naruto watched, horrified, as Kamiko and Kakashi, the two strongest shinobi he knew after his own clan elders and Hokage, were shredded apart, their shocked faces seared into his mind. At that moment, Naruto realized that he couldn't move. No matter how much he tried to lift even a single finger, he felt his feet firmly planted on the ground, his arms unable to move, his very lungs frozen in time. He knew what this was. He'd heard it often enough to recognize it with ease. He was utterly terrified. Bitter coldness ran through his veins as he passively watched the two masked shinobi, both wearing what seemed to be breeder masks, rush at the petrified genin and their charge. None of the genin had seen death before, and to see their two most powerful members get killed in an instant was morale-shattering. Only belatedly did he realize that Hikari had moved in front of the team and Tazuna, her flame-colored hair whipping in the air as she made a gesture they were all unfamiliar with. In an instant, a cloud of smoke burst into existence next to her, revealing her usual gigantic scroll. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the scroll, twisted on her heel, and used it to club one of the enemy shinobi out of the way, the linked chain between them pulling the other one off his feet as they went flying into the forest brush. Naruto-sama. Hikari cried as she turned to face where her enemies had gone. Her expression was more serious than anything Naruto had ever seen on the girl before. There wasn't an inch of compassion in her eyes or joie de vivre at this one moment. Hikari was shinobi. Nothing more, nothing less. Please see to your client's safety. With that half-order, Naruto snapped out of his stupor, and immediately wanted to kick himself. How could he have frozen this way? Turning to his teammates, he punched Kiba in the arm lightly and waved in front of Hinata, snapping them out as well. Come on, he stated seriously. Hikari-chan's got this. We have to keep the old geezer safe. Kiba glared at him for a moment for the punch, then nodded stiffly. Hinata, realizing what she'd done, blushed furiously in embarrassment at her own weakness, then offered a small smile. With a murmur and a quick hand sign, she quickly invoked her bloodline. Byakugan, she murmured softly. I see everything, she informed her teammates shyly. Naruto nodded firmly before looking to Kiba. Kiba, you and I have to keep our eyes on Tazuna. Hinata, you keep watch for any surprises. He quickly assigned roles as he put his back to Tazuna's, while Kiba stood in front of the old man, Akamaru growling softly as the canine watched the fight between Hikari and the two murderers. The Uzumaki clanswoman was having little trouble, it seemed. Weaving between the two ambushers' attacks, she refrained from using her summons as she worked to beat them down in as much a non-lethal way as possible, for some reason. To Naruto, it just seemed like she was taking Kimiko and Kakashi's deaths in stride, though. Either way, the two ambushers quickly found themselves on the defensive as the red-headed girl lashed out with punches and kicks that shouldn't have been possible for a girl her size. Each one hit with the force of a sledgehammer, and the two found themselves having to dodge more than they could attack. And when they did, she just turned the tables on them again and kept going. Little bitch, shouted one of the ambushers as he tried to slash her with his sharpened gauntlet claws. Naruto watched as Hikari amazingly bent backwards with surprising gymnastic ability, dodged the claw, then continued her backward motion until she clasped her legs around her attacker's arm, slamming him into the ground. Landing on her feet, Hikari smirked as she regarded the other ambusher, who'd held back and watched his partner get plowed into the ground. Gonna call me names too, jerk, she taunted as she raised a finger and made the universal gesture of, come at me, bro, the ambusher growled, but made no overt moves. He just stood there, contemplating her. I know I'm really pretty and all, but just staring is kinda creepy, you know? Hikari noted smugly as she remained in her ready stance, the other ambusher groaning still while he lay on the ground. The remaining attacker was silent as he carefully regarded Hikari, then began chuckling, much to Hikari's wariness. That wasn't the laugh of a desperate man, it was the laugh of someone with an ace up his sleeve. Stupid bitch, the remaining ambusher taunted, his voice distorted by the breather mask. Even though his partner had said much of the same thing, Hikari felt her skin tingle. This was much unlike the last time. This wasn't the taunt of an angry man. This was the tone of a man who knew something she did not. Gotcha. Hikari-san. Hikari's eyes widened, her brain processing Hinata's horrified shout as she flung herself sideways, a gigantic cleaver slamming into the ground where she'd stood moments before. Gritting her teeth as she rolled back onto a squat, she found herself unable to follow through with a retaliatory strike as the remaining ambusher launched himself at her, clawed gauntlets slashing away. She cringed as one nicked her stomach, ripping away strips of her shirt and drawing some superficial blood. Not that she had time to dwell on that, as the cleaver was soon back, swinging away at her and forcing Hikari to keep dodging. During one such dodge, she spied Naruto and Kiba looking about ready to move to help her, prompting her to nearly panic. "Naruto-sama. Don't," she shouted as she jumped back, avoiding another slash just barely. "I'll handle this." The thought of it was preposterous, of course, but then she didn't exactly have Kakashi and Kimiko around to help her. She wondered about those two, in fact. Hadn't they managed to draw out the ambushers they were looking for? What the hell was the holdup? Naruto-kun. Above. Hinata had always known what most people thought of her: weird, shy, incompetent, her family, mostly, but if there was one skill she held any sort of small measure of pride, it was her observational skills, with and without the Byakugan. That's why the moment the Senbon flew, she saw them. Her blonde comrade and worst secret ever crush was, in turn, extraordinarily quick on his feet, and quickly tackled Tazuna aside, just as a shower of the potentially deadly projectiles impacted the ground where they'd stood. "Hinata." Kiba barked, already looking a great deal more feral as he dropped to all fours, Akamaru right by him. "Give me a target." Hinata scanned the area worriedly, feeling her anxiety bubble up quickly. Where had the attacker gone? Where was he? She couldn't afford to mess up now, when Naruto and Kiba were depending on her. She could feel the crippling anxiety slowly rise through her. What chance did they have? Kakashi-sensei and Kimiko-san had both been killed early on, and Hikari-san was now fighting two strong opponents by herself. What chance did they have? She felt her Byakugan flicker slightly as she began to lose control, her entire body beginning to tremble with fear as her emotional side began to take over. "Hinata." Kiba shouted again, dodging barely in time as another shower of Senbon threatened to take him out. Apparently whoever was attacking had realized that he had the most offensive potential out of the three genin. "Two," Hinata stuttered, her mind slowly shutting down as the battle raged around her. So absorbed she was with her own terror that she hadn't even noticed the kunai sent her way by the cleaver-wielding man, the snap action designed to distract Hikari long enough to get a good hit in. While it failed in that stated goal, due in part to the fact that Hikari tried to catch it before barely dodging the cleaver, the kunai nonetheless sped directly towards Hinata, who stood there, shell-shocked at the violence around her. "Hinata!" Naruto roared desperately, as he noticed the lethal throwing knife go right for her heart. He made a move to go save her, only to be stopped by the sudden arrival of another shower of Senbon needles as they tried to skewer him and Tazuna, forcing him to dodge aside with the client as the kunai sped freely towards his friend. Kiba, also kept away from his partner, gave a guttural cry of infuriated impotence as he was forced away from Hinata by the pinpoint needle strikes. How had it come to this? How had they gone from a happy outing to such a horrifying scenario in such a short time? Hinata saw the kunai coming easily, but found her body would not react. All she could do was stare as, in slow motion, the knife creeped closer towards her, its razor edge pitted towards her heart. Her heart, the heart she wanted to give to Naruto in a totally not psychopathic way. The knife edged closer. Closer now. Mere inches away. There was no dodging it, not escaping. Perhaps her father had been right all along. Perhaps she was a total failure. Yano. The knife never came. Hinata's vision cleared up as the world seemed to come into focus again, her front suddenly blocked by someone's back. Blinking away her confusion, she looked up and saw a familiar stalk of gray hair, followed by a familiar green vest. "Kakashi." "Kakashi-sensei?" she asked in a whimper. "Humph," she heard someone scoff next to Kakashi, and she turned her gaze to another familiar figure, clad in a combat kimono. He's not the only one here, you know. Kimiko. Both Kakashi and Kimiko had returned, and from the looks on their faces, they were both rather pissed. Kakashi brought up the kunai to eye level and examined it, before gazing back at the two ambushers who'd momentarily halted their attack on Hikari to draw back, unsure what to make of the new arrivals, just as Hikari returned to Kakashi and Kimiko's side, breathing hard. A third figure quickly appeared at their side, wearing hunter-nin regalia. Kakashi's eye narrowed. From the masked shinobi's physique, he would have estimated a youth no older than 15 or 16 years of age. However, the skill the shinobi was displaying was far beyond the talent such a youth ought to have been able to display, his own case and Itachi's notwithstanding. Kimiko, however, was far less analytical of the situation. She felt rage bubble up in her as she spied the ambushers' slashed headbands. Kirigakure. 3 villages remained firmly on the Uzumaki clan's shit list, and Kirigakure had the unfortunate distinction of topping it by a wide margin. It had been Kiri troops that had laid waste to most of Yuzu. It had been Kiri troops who'd taken particular efforts to wipe out the Uzumaki. It had been Kiri troops which had chased her clan out of their ancestral homeland. It was all Kiri's fault. Momochi Zabuza, Kakashi greeted the apparent leader of the ambushers, well aware of the maelstrom of furious emotion raging within his comrade's soul. He might not have been aware of the gritty details, but the fact that she was having such a negative reaction to 3 ex-Kiri shinobi couldn't be a coincidence. He then glanced at the remaining breeder shinobi. And one half of the demon brothers, right? The cleaver-wielding man smirked under his facial bandages and shouldered the weapon. Hatake Kakashi. Copycat Kakashi. The man of 1,000 jutsus, the leader of the enemy troop greeted in kind. I have to say, I'm honored. Kakashi would have rolled his eyes if this wasn't such a problematic situation. Thieves and bandits, he could handle, since they were typical hazards on C-rank escort missions. However, when an A-rank missing nin like Zabuza popped up, it usually meant something had gone horribly wrong. Kakashi allowed himself to glance at Tazuna for a second before returning his attention to the enemy shinobi. Or Tazuna was lying about the importance of his job. Well, logical deduction would dictate that the latter was more probable. I mean, what were the odds of dropping in on 4 missing nins? Twice? Kakashi-sensei. Kimiko-sanchin. Kiba and Naruto chorused as they made to move towards him and Kimiko. They were quickly halted by Kakashi raising a hand towards them, indicating they should stop. Stay with the client and Hinata, he ordered calmly as he raised his outstretched hand and placed it on his headband, slowly lifting it up to reveal his implanted Sharingan eye. I'm afraid having you nearby might be distracting right now, and we can't have that. Kimiko nodded as she slid into a combat stance and bit the tip of her left thumb, then proceeding to use that hand to raise her right sleeve until her bicep was bare, pale skin. Stay safe, Naruto-sama. We'll deal with this. Hikari flashed them a comforting smile as she hefted the huge scroll and placed it next to her, ready to be unraveled. We got this, guys. Naruto wanted to object, loudly, but Kiba promptly stopped him as he realized how true that was. Even within pack dynamics, a pup was useless in a fight with older canines, and so were usually excluded until deemed ready. This was one such time. If the adults needed them, Kiba was sure they would ask for their help. Don't, the feral-looking boy told his comrade. They're right. The mission comes first. He tried to appeal to Naruto's professionalism if he had any. Fortunately, Naruto understood well enough to let them have their way, instead settling for glaring at Kimiko and Hikari's backs. Don't do anything stupid, he told them before going back to Tazuna, who looked quite shaken by the events unfolding. Hikari giggled in amusement as she readied her scroll, while Kimiko's mouth twitched briefly. Only Kakashi didn't quite seem to get the joke. What's so funny? He asked the two girls. Naruto-sama is considerate, Kimiko stated plainly. Hikari just giggled harder. He's such a sweetie. Kakashi rolled his eyes. If you two are quite done, there's 3 rather lethal shinobi over there wanting to kill us, he snarked. Hikari's giggle stopped, while Kimiko glared at the 3 missing Nins, having remembered that they were from Kiri. Hikari, she stated calmly, but a rising undercurrent of fury nonetheless began to permeate her words. They're Kiri shinobi. I know, Hikari answered softly. She'd seen the slashed headbands while fighting the cleaver guy and his gauntlet subordinate. Like Kimiko, a well of emotions had risen up in her, but she had done her very best to keep a lid on it. Losing one's cool in battle was a surefire way to get yourself killed. Kakashi pretended not to hear them as he kept his Sharingan eye trained on Zabuza. While he knew next to nothing about the Hunter Nin, the Gauntlet One was clearly half of the Devil Brothers duo, and as such well within Hikari's skill set to take on. Whatever your issues, you too, remember we're here to protect the kids and the client, not cash in on some old grudge, understand? He asked them seriously as his hands drifted towards his kunai pouches. Both girls grunted their assent as they tensed up, ready to go. Kakashi nodded curtly. All right then, he saw Zabuza tense, and he knew it was go time. Let's go. Kakashi had shouted the order, but neither Hikari nor Kimiko had moved. The rogue shinobi, however, had no such qualms, with the Hunter Nin immediately flinging more Senbon needles, while the one with the breather mask charged at Hikari, his clawed combat glove ready to tear at her skin. Only Zabuza had stayed put, raising one hand before him in a very obvious half-hand seal of the rat, his other hand raised up high in the other half. Kirigakure no Jutsu, Zabuza intoned dangerously, mist already starting to form all around him. Kakashi, a little miffed that neither Uzumaki had chosen to follow his lead, suddenly realized how precarious their situation was. Zabuza was a proficient silent killer, and while the hidden mist technique was worthless against higher-level shinobi, like himself and probably Kimiko, his genin had no chance. The genin, he barked at Kimiko and Hikari, who both frowned as they quickly recognized his warning. In an instant, both Uzumaki clan's women jumped back, closer to their charge, easily avoiding the initial strikes from their opponents. Kakashi, for his part, reached his team much faster, quickly setting up position in front of them. Eyes open, he barked at them, his eyes narrowing. Zabuza's best at killing in this sort of situation. Don't drop your guard in any direction. Naruto and Kiba tensed, while Hinata whimpered a bit, still trying to regain control of herself after her near-death experience. Tazuna swallowed as he remained in the middle of the genin 3-man circle, unsure what to do with himself. He'd feared this might happen, but the trip had been so peaceful, so calm, that he'd begun to hope that perhaps he'd been too paranoid. Well, not anymore. You're kind to say so, Zabuza said with an evil chuckle, somewhere within the thick mist. Even Hikari and Kimiko's opponents had now vanished, apparently following their leader's lead. It made sense, really. Why go for the frontal strike, when you could put the enemy off balance? But you know, knowing isn't the same as having the skill to stop me, Sharingan no Kakashi. He chuckled again, prompting goosebumps in all 3 genin. Kakashi couldn't blame them, not really. They were all such rookies, still. They'd never met with someone with as much killing experience as Zabuza, or with as little moral hiccups about performing his job. Even though Kakashi was, on paper, much more lethal, he'd always made it a point to keep himself as harmless as possible, on the outside. It made clients feel safer. Right now, however, appearing warm and cuddly wasn't a priority, however. Unfortunately, nor could he show off his hyperlethal persona, given that he had no visible opponent to direct it towards. Even if he did, there was no guarantee that a former ANBU-class ninja like Zabuza would be affected by it. I hate the mist, growled Kimiko as she slid further and further back, towards the genin. Like Kakashi, she seemed to have come to the conclusion that the client was the most likely target. Hikari giggled nervously. Shame Maki isn't here. she'd have nixed this technique in an instant. Both women tensed instantly and then blocked another attack from their unseen attackers, prompting a rather vicious growl from Kimiko, while Hikari quieted down. "Kimiko Hikari-chan," Naruto spoke up worriedly. "Stay where you are, Naruto-sama." Kimiko barked impatiently as she scanned the area around them. "This isn't a training exercise." Another malevolent chuckle in the mist. "Such devotion," Zabuza crooned dangerously, still out of sight. Kakashi's head snapped to his left, where he let out a few shurikens. Again, Zabuza laughed. "What are you aiming at, Hataki?" Kakashi frowned. This was a dangerous situation. He had 3 charges to protect, and 2 fellow ninjas whom he wasn't sure he could rely upon to protect 2 of those 3. In addition, that Hunter Nin imposter seemed pretty able, and while the remaining demon brother was probably a pushover, comparatively speaking, he was sure that between Zabuza and the masked Nin, he was in very real trouble. "Hinata, do you see anything?" he asked, as calmly as he could. The last thing he needed was for the most neurotic member of his team to have another breakdown. The Hyuga heiress swallowed nervously before shaking her head, still recovering from her previous breakdown. "And no," she all but whimpered. "I'm so sorry," Kakashi sighed imperceptibly. Perhaps Hinata hadn't been ready for the next step in her ninja training. Then again, he supposed her reaction was much more normal, in the face of the sudden difficulty jump the mission had undergone. "It's okay," he assured her, still scanning the thick mist for any sign that Zabuza was nearby. "Just keep your eyes peeled. That goes for all 3 of you." "Hi, sensei." All 3 genin answered dutifully. Kakashi was glad. At least they could still show some semblance of self-control. "Pfft," Zabuza scoffed within the midst. "Such dutiful little cannon fodder. Show yourself." Kimiko demanded, feeling her rage slowly build up as she was unable to exact her revenge on the enemies of her clan. Now, Zabuza taunted. "That wouldn't be very shinobi-esque of me, now would it?" Kimiko bared her grit teeth, her anger reaching peak levels. Beside her, Hikari glanced at her barely visible clanswoman with growing anxiety. Hikari had managed to keep a lid on her feelings when she'd realized the enemy was from Kiri, but she knew Kimiko would have a much harder time doing so. To the older clanswoman, they were the reason her family was gone. Why the Uzumaki had been forced to live in comparative squalor. "We need to break this mist," Hikari told Kakashi as she blocked a few kunai sent her way. Even her gauntlet opponent seemed at ease within the thick mist. How on earth were they tracking the group? "I'm open to suggestions," Kakashi admitted as he kept both eyes bared. He hated to admit it, but right now, he was somewhat drawing a blank. A plan using his Ninken had occurred to him, but with 2 other unknowns possibly ready to sacrifice Zabuza for the kill, his margin of error was pretty damn slim. Too slim for his peace of mind. "Jump," Kimiko growled. Kakashi blinked. "What?" he asked, confused at the redhead's sudden order. Kimiko's eyes were ablaze now, her fury having overcome the last of her tolerance. "I said jump." Without further warning, her bloody thumb raced down the length of her opposing arm, the splatter of blood amazingly seeping right into her pearly skin. Then, to Kakashi's amazement, strange characters inked themselves into being, racing from her shoulder to her elbow, with a very distinct swirl pattern in their midst. "Kuchios," she intoned as the characters began glowing bright, the sudden surge of chakra causing her long, red hair to billow. "Yukai no Kazuchi," she growled dangerously. Kakashi blinked for a moment before the name clicked. "She can't be serious," he mumbled, somewhat surprised at this revelation. The miracle mallet, as it was otherwise known, was merely a myth. Yet, before his eyes, even despite the thick mist, a rather large hammer appeared in her hands, totally belying the legendary mallet's description as a small hammer. Moreover, rather than a simple mallet, it appeared as an intricate warhammer, lovingly forged and carved with intricate, swirl designs where the metal met the shaft. Seeing her raise it, her chakra level spiking, Kakashi immediately realized her intention and turned to his genin. Jump, he ordered before dashing to Tazuna, grabbing him, and putting as much chakra into his feet before launching himself upwards. Without further warning, Kimiko let out a howl of exertion as she swung the hammer down onto the ground, the chakra-reinforced blow impacting the ground like a bomb. The very ground fractured on impact, fissures running everywhere without prejudice or thought as the road rose was destroyed by the allegedly mythical weapon. The mist started to thin out almost immediately. Zabuza's control over it had been broken thanks to the distraction caused by the cataclysmic event. Yet, even so, Kakashi was now faced with a new problem, a very uneven battleground, as Kimiko's reckless move had caused the entire area to look like a massive earthquake had rent the ground asunder. Yar, yar, he heard Hikari sigh as she began to fall next to him. The younger Uzumaki seemed almost used to this sort of thing. I haven't seen that one in a while. There's more? Kakashi asked tightly, almost afraid to know. Hikari snorted. It's Kimiko's special technique. Everyone summons companions to fight. She just summons more weapons. Oddly enough, Kakashi thought it was a perfect fit for the loner Uzumaki girl. On the other hand, however, he glanced down at the sole person still on the ground. Kimiko was standing there, the large warhammer in hand, and she was glaring up at the sky, opposite himself. Ignoring Tazuna's incredulous exclamations, Kakashi followed her line of sight, and narrowed his own eyes. Zabuza. The hidden mist swordsman had made it out all right, as did his masked colleague. The gauntlet shinobi, however, was nowhere to be seen. Probably had been taken out by Kimiko's attack. Either way, Kakashi had unfinished business with the man. Falling back down, he buckled a bit under the added weight of Tazuna and the uneven ground before managing to stabilize, a little miffed at not having thought of Kimiko's strategy before she had. Then again, he didn't exactly like big, flashy attacks, so maybe that was it. Go back to the genin, he instructed Tazuna as he slid back into a combat-ready stance. The old builder nodded weakly before hopping along the ground fragments left standing after Kimiko's devastating area attack. Seems your mist is done for, Zabuza, he remarked idly as he grasped his left wrist, ready to activate his signature Chidori. Beside him, Hikari landed softly, obviously far more used to this sort of thing than he was. Zabuza glared at him, then at Kimiko for good measure, as the red-headed Uzumaki clanswoman hefted the warhammer onto her shoulder. I see you're not as weak as I thought, he growled. Zabuza-san, Kakashi's ears pricked up as the masked shinobi apparently spoke up for the first time. Surprisingly soft, and young. How old was that shinobi? Zabuza glowered at his companion for a moment before reluctantly nodding and turning away. We're done here, he declared before drawing his great sword and swinging it towards Kakashi, keeping it level as it aimed at the copy ninja. Thank your lucky stars, Hataki. And whoever that bitch is. We'll settle this later. Kakashi glared, but the ferocity of his was no match for Kimiko's, who suddenly launched herself at Zabuza, hammer already high and ready to swing. Who's the bitch, Kiri scum, she threatened as she sailed overhead. Hikari. Hi, the younger Uzumaki acquiesced as she stood, legs spread, her hands flipping through an impressive amount of hand seals before settling in with the seal of the rat. Uzumaki Fuinjutsu, she chanted, unaware of Tazuna suddenly becoming a shade paler. Kasoku Fuin. Immediately, seal arrays appeared around the masked shinobi and Zabuza, surprising them as lines of sealing characters raced towards them, prompting them to jump straight up to avoid them. Right into Kimiko's path. With a guttural cry of exertion, the redhead's muscles flexed as she swung forward the large hammer, its head glowing with chakra. Whatever it hit would not be getting back up again. Zabuza seemed to have realized this, as he quickly threw the masked ninja aside and brought up his famed executioner's blade to block the attack. Legendary weapon met legendary weapon head-on as the two shinobi refused to back down. Zabuza's cold, merciless eyes met Kimiko's raging glare, both shinobi grunting as the chakra buildup between the executioner's blade and the miracle mallet threatened to grow out of control, possibly crippling whoever lost out in this contest of strength. Such strength. Zabuza growled, a little surprised at how the red-headed woman was matching him. Kimiko, however, had no such words of respect, as she merely growled fiercely. Eventually, however, neither the mallet nor the blade was able to hold on for much longer, and the chakra build-up did what it would in any other such situation. It exploded. With a large blast, Zabuza and Kimiko flew to opposing sides, their weapons flying free of their masters. Kimiko hit the ground hard, crying out in pain as she slammed into the ground, rolled, and finished rammed against a tree. Despite the force of the impact, and Naruto and Hikari's cries of surprise and worry, the fact that she soon tried to get up told them she was still alive, if rather injured. Her mallet, for its part, came to a rest nearby, looking a little worse for wear, but still usable. Zabuza fared little better. The explosion flung the former Kiri ninja right into the forest, ramming him into various branches before hitting the ground and rolling until he came to a full stop against a nearby tree. A few meters away, his executioner's blade ended its flight by stabbing into the ground, the blade itself cracked but otherwise somewhat intact. Immediately the masked ninja sped towards his colleague, while the genin, Tazuna, and Hikari went for Kimiko. Only Kakashi remained where he was, and he quickly debated how to proceed. On the one hand, he could let Zabuza go and help Kimiko. On the other hand, he could attack Zabuza now and end the threat to his team and the client right here and now. It didn't take him long to decide. With a grunt, his extended hand became alight with electricity, crackling and making an odd chirping noise. His Sharingan Tomo spinning wildly, he charged at Zabuza's prone form, knowing that he'd be competing with the masked shinobi, who was much closer to Zabuza, in order to reach the fallen missing nin. He didn't make it. Just as he drew his arm back and readied the sab, the masked shinobi gave a cry of alarm and suddenly sped up, quickly overtaking Kakashi, grabbing Zabuza, and getting out of the way. As such, Kakashi simply felt his hand cut through the trunk of the tree the former swordsman of the mist had been leaning against. Frowning at his miss, he turned to look for the executioner's blade, reasoning that even if Zabuza remained alive, his skills would be substantially decreased by depriving him of his blade. It was nowhere to be found. The masked ninja must have taken it. Kakashi growled softly to himself. What a mess this mission had become. Kimiko ne. Hikari cried out as she slid into position next to the older redhead. Kimiko. Naruto joined in as he, too, came to rest next to his kinswoman. You alright, Kimiko-chan? Fine, Kimiko groaned as she tried to get up, but failed. She gave a soft grunt of pain as she fell on her side, gritting her teeth and tightening her eyes as she felt her ribs poking where they shouldn't. Ribs, Naruto watched silently as Hikari nodded in understanding and dug through her traveling bags for bandages and splints. To Naruto, what he'd just seen, the way his older kinsman had fought it, was all so incredible. He had to fight to keep a grin off his face, knowing neither Kimiko nor Hikari would probably appreciate his usual, exuberant attitude right now. Even so, he couldn't help but replay the sight of Kimiko wielding that awesome hammer and destroying the ground with a single swing, looking like the world's most pissed-off blacksmith. The moment Kakashi had insisted he jump, he'd grabbed Hinata, who was still somewhat out of it, and done as asked, not even a little bit aware that the poor girl had blushed furiously at the close contact. When the hammer struck ground, he'd thought the earth had exploded, given the ridiculous effects it had caused. Kiba had swore quite a bit at the sight, while Akamaru whined, a little unsettled at what had happened. For Naruto, however, this was not a source of fear or caution, but of pride. His clansman had done that. His clansman. For years, he'd been the butt of ridicule and ostracizing. For years, he'd endured social neglect and jeers. He'd often pondered on the possibility that his family had garnered a reputation of traitors or criminals, hence the explanation for his treatment. Seeing Kimiko in action, however, had blown those remaining fears away. His clan was strong. They were loyal to each other. And while Kimiko was about as approachable as a coiled viper, she'd nonetheless gone up against Zabuza ostensibly to protect him, without question or protest. "What you grinning about?" Hikari asked him, surprising him out of his thoughts. Naruto blinked, unaware his self-control, though arguably practically non-existent to begin with, had caved, and his grin had finally bloomed. Rallying, he simply grinned wider and looked down at Kimiko, who was looking at him in confusion. "That was awesome, Kimiko-chan," he told her earnestly, flashing her a thumbs up. The red-headed clanswoman's eyes widened a bit at the declaration in honest surprise, and Naruto was sure he saw a glimmer of embarrassment in those eyes of hers before she huffed and turned away, prompting Hikari to giggle. "Flatterer," the younger Uzumaki woman noted wryly. "It was, though," Naruto insisted as he kept smiling down at Kimiko. "Can I learn that summoning stuff?" Kimiko glanced at him for a moment before looking away quickly, a mild tinge of red on her cheeks showing up before being ruthlessly put down by the woman's exorbitant self-control. "I'm afraid not, Naruto-sama. This jutsu was tailor-made for me," she stated firmly. Hikari smiled slyly. "But I'm sure you could teach him a thing or two about sealing, right?" she proposed not so innocently. "After all, the basics are the same." The glare Kimiko flashed Hikari could have ended a country, though the younger clanswoman merely kept her smile firm. Hikari had seen an opportunity to force the elder woman to connect with the future clan head, and she wasn't about to let it slip her grasp. Besides, she added sweetly, though Kimiko was never once fooled, "You're going to be bedridden for at least a few days. Might as well make it productive." Kimiko looked about to protest when the bane of her existence decided to speak up. "That sounds like a great idea," Kakashi agreed as he walked up with Tazuna, pulling down his headband back over his Sharingan-wielding eye. "Really?" Naruto exclaimed, feeling excited. Kakashi smiled at his most exuberant pupil. "Of course. In fact, I think all three of you may benefit from Kimiko-san's knowledge of seals," he added, nodding to Kiba and Hinata, whose eyes widened as they were suddenly included in the impromptu lesson plan. He couldn't blame them. It was highly irregular for a clan to teach outside the constraints of family. Even more irregular was that he was pushing for it, considering his aversion to the Uzumaki influencing his lesson plans. If Kimiko had looked like she wasn't going to protest before, that quickly changed as her face pinkened and she struggled to rise, something quickly countered by Hikari, who activated a restraining seal on the older woman. She'd pay for it later, she was sure, but this was a good opportunity to help Kimiko break out of her shell. Something she had no doubts Kakashi had realized as well. Naruto grinned excitedly. Keisuke had made sealing sound so boring that he'd been bored to tears numerous times when the senior clansman had opted to begin his lessons. However, seeing Kimiko's sealing knowledge put into practice this way had given him a whole new appreciation for the craft. Moreover, he could share his knowledge with Kiba and Hinata. He was sure they were as excited as he was to learn more about the Uzumaki's strange skills. It never once occurred to him that them learning alongside him would be breaking centuries of traditions. Kimiko, however, could not stop thinking of only that. She was widely considered, and feared, as the Uzumaki clan's enforcer, which meant these traditions were under her purview. If she, the clan's law enforcer, was seen or said to break these traditions, what role could she possibly play? She would be disgraced. A traitor. Was that what Kakashi sought for? To have her own clan exile her? If so, she wouldn't bite at the bait. She would teach Naruto, and Naruto alone, but not his teammates. Hikari must have seen her intentions through her body language, because the summoner frowned at her momentarily before looking up at Naruto and smiling. "That sounds wonderful," the younger Uzumaki female agreed as she nodded to Kakashi, who momentarily seemed taken aback by the ready agreement. "It's very important that everyone here expand their horizons. You never know when a seal could save your life." Naruto, however, couldn't have cared less. He was far too happy celebrating his future training under Kimiko with Kiba and Hinata, who both seemed uneasy about the prospect, to have paid much attention to Hikari and Kakashi. The cyclopedian ninja chuckled at the sight before slowly drawing his vision towards Tazuna, who stood, pale-faced, next to him. Kakashi hadn't forgotten how the man had reacted to the arrival of the enemy shinobi. It hadn't been surprise, so much as resignation. Combined with the use of the hidden mist jutsu, Kakashi was fairly certain he knew what was going on here. Well, we can discuss the details later, he noted idly. For now, why don't we take Tazuna-san back home, eh? The old bridge builder swallowed nervously at the suggestion, further reinforcing Kakashi's suspicions. Nevertheless, Tazuna nodded, while the genin showed their approval, along with Hikari, who agreed on her and Kimiko's behalf. Wave Country, one day later. All right, Tazuna-san, explain. Kakashi, Hikari, and a bedridden Kimiko were all gathered in the girls' room, along with Tazuna, who looked like he desperately wanted a shot of whatever alcohol was readily available. However, to ensure that the old man focused on the issue at hand, Kakashi had forbade the man's rather beautiful daughter, Tsunami, from giving him any ninja business, he'd said, which effectively covered his bases on pretty much any issue under the sun. Tazuna sighed despondently as she plopped down on the wooden floor and leaned against the back wall. He pinched his nose in silent frustration before nodding. All right, he agreed. Taking a deep breath, he began his tale. You know of Gado, right? Hikari blinked blankly while Kimiko shook her head ever so slightly. Only Kakashi nodded. The owner of Gado Corporation, right? He asked. At Tazuna's nod, he elaborated for the sake of the Uzumaki women. He's an important businessman in Fire Country. Owns shipping companies and holds lucrative shipping contracts up and down the coast. He tilted his head while staring at Tazuna. But his headquarters is here, isn't it? Tazuna nodded, confirming Kakashi's explanation. Basically. Wave's greatest son, he thinks he is. Pfft. He's a super jackass, is what he is. All those shipping contracts. Those export-import businesses. Fronts. All of them. Uses them to funnel drugs and other illegal goods, he added bitterly. Why haven't the authorities detained him, then? Hikari asked, confused. Next to her, Kimiko frowned silently, apparently also in confusion. Tazuna scoffed. He is the authorities, lass, he informed the two young women. If it ain't in Gado's super deep pockets, it doesn't exist, here in Wave. What about the daimyo? Kimiko asked, her voice a little raspy from the pain. To Hikari's growing confusion, the older kinsman's tone had a rather urgent quality to it. Almost desperate, even. Why doesn't he intervene? Tazuna was silent for a moment before glancing away. Daimyo's in his pocket, too, he admitted sadly. Things haven't been good in a while. Tazuna's answer was obviously not what Kimiko had wanted to hear, because the redhead seemed rather distressed by the news. Hikari looked over at Kakashi, who seemed rather stoic at the whole situation. So why are you on this man's hit list, Tazuna-san? Kakashi asked simply. Tazuna clicked his tongue angrily. Little Toad owns every boat and port in the country, Tazuna explained. But Wave ain't super far away from Fire, so I figured I'd build a super bridge to it. Cut off Gado's influence, you mean, Kakashi deduced. Break the monopoly. Tazuna nodded. Yeah. Except that didn't go so well, yeah? No one here would back it. Had to smuggle myself out to even find the funding for it. Found an investor at the Fire Capital, but he needs it done soon, so I hauled ass back here, Tazuna noted, crossing his arms angrily. Except Gado sends me this super annoying messenger telling me to back off or he'd kill me, right? Now, I ain't afraid to die for my people, but if I died, who'd take care of Tsunami-chan and my grandson? Kakashi grimaced a bit, despite himself. They'd met the old man's daughter and grandson. Whatever charm the young woman had displayed, her son had obviously not inherited it, as he'd constantly moped and whined all throughout their arrival. Inari, he thought the kid was named. Anyway, he'd run off soon after, though not before royally pissing off Naruto. Which was another problem in itself. But one which could be dealt with later. Anyway, so that's why I came to Konoha. Figured if anyone could cough up a few shinobi to protect my super old bones, it'd be you guys, Tazuna explained. Didn't expect the prices to be so high, though. And that's why you lied, Kakashi reminded him sternly. You realize that by doing so, we are fully within our rights to leave you here cold, right? Tazuna nodded despondently before letting his head drop such that his chin touched his chest. Yeah, I figured, he said before raising his gaze and looking at Kakashi defiantly. Even so, I don't regret it. I couldn't afford more than a C rank on the budget I was given, and I needed to make it back here. I figured, a jonin would be more than enough to deal with whatever Gato sent our way, even if there were 3 squirts around. He then frowned. Never expected that Super Toad to hire Shinobi, though. That's beside the point, Kakashi insisted as he, too, crossed his arms. Tazuna-san, were it not for the fact that Kimiko-san and Hikari-san were around, the results of that fight might have gone far worse. My genin are in no condition to be fighting A-rank ninjas. For once, we agree, Kimiko muttered from her prone position as she glared at the old bridge builder. Which means, Kakashi continued, ignoring Kimiko's comments, that it would be the best decision all around to leave. I'm sure Konoha will send you back a refund, or renegotiate for a more appropriate fee and team. Tazuna raised his head to meet Kakashi's stare before looking up and sighing as he closed his eyes. Then you've killed us all, he stated simply. Kakashi frowned. There really was no need for the man to get so dramatic. Zabuza has been injured, Tazuna-san. I'm sure he'll be out of fighting condition for a bit. In that time, it would be very easy to acquire a new team. Tazuna chuckled incredulously. You think that's what I'm worried about? He asked, sounding totally defeated. Those shinobi were new for me, but it ain't even a drop in Gato's army of mercenaries. Right now, all that's probably keeping him from attacking my home and killing me and my family are you guys. 3 dead in a freak robbing incident. He won't even lose a wink of sleep over it. Killing Konoha shinobi? That'd put a crimp in his business deals with fire. Kakashi said nothing, but silently, and reluctantly, agreed with the man's assessment. While shinobi dying on missions was nothing new, there would be a few raised eyebrows if a team ostensibly on a C-rank mission suddenly died after having arrived at their destination. Which put him in a rather uncomfortable spot. Kakashi had wanted to confront Tazuna right after the ambush, but Kimiko's situation had forced his hand and made him postpone the inevitable confrontation until they'd reached Wave, where Hikari could more safely perform whatever procedures she needed to guarantee her kinsman's health. While not life-threatening, Kimiko's injuries were sufficient to warrant some concern, so he'd waited. Only now, leaving would be monstrously immoral, even if it was well within Konoha's regulations. And while Kakashi didn't consider himself a saint by any measure of the word, he did think of himself as a man with righteous and well-defined morals. Which was why this was such a hard situation to deal with. On the one hand, he had his team to protect, and that demanded that they leave immediately, or at least as soon as Kimiko was in shape to move on her own. On the other, leaving Tazuna and his family unprotected was basically asking for a massacre. A less restrained man would have screamed in frustration, or at least growled. Kakashi merely accepted his situation stoically. You're sure that would be his reaction? He asked Tazuna, dreading the answer. Tazuna scoffed. No. I wager it'd be super crueler in reality, he stated with conviction. Last time someone stood up to him, it was my son-in-law, Kaiza. Gato strung him up in the middle of the town, in broad daylight, and had him tortured and executed, in public and in his presence. Hikari looked sick at the revelation, while Kimiko looked like she could chew through steel right now, judging from how set her jaw was. Only Kakashi kept his feelings well compartmentalized. How had we not heard of this? Hikari asked softly to Kimiko. Keisuke Koro would have easily come to help these people for free. Kimiko didn't answer, though she suspected she already knew why. So that's what you'll be doing to us if you leave, Kakashi-san, Tazuna stated grimly. I ain't one for guilt-tripping, but that's the way things are here. I'm not afraid to dirty my hands a bit if it means I can protect the people I love. Kakashi was silent, though he knew Hikari and Kimiko were both very much in favor of staying and helping. Truth was, however, their opinions didn't matter. Not because he thought them inferior or anything, but because they weren't the ones hired under false pretenses. If they wanted to stay, it'd be of their own free will, but as far as he and his team were concerned, leaving or staying, that was his decision. And the truth was, it was not an easy one to make, or one he was even ready to pronounce himself on. I'll think about it, he bargained for now, closing his eyes as he stood back up and went for the door. I'll let you know what I decide, Tazuna-san. The old bridge builder nodded sadly, while Kimiko and Hikari threw him a few judging frowns. Kakashi ignored both of them. He had to think of what was best for everyone, not just strangers who'd lied to him and endangered his teammates. Without another word, he slid open the door and walked out. Naruto was not happy. Not just because of that Inari brat though. Yes, the little kid did manage to get under his skin with his "there are no heroes" bullshit, but rather because of what Hinata had just told him and Kiba, after having basically eavesdropped on Kakashi, Kimiko, Hikari, and Tazuna's conversation by reading their lips via Byakugan. Damn, Kiba muttered, stroking a despondent Akamaru's white fur as the puppy rested quietly on his lap. That's messed up. Hinata nodded in agreement, looking down shyly, a little embarrassed that she'd been speaking for so long, especially in Naruto's presence. Kakashi won't abandon them, right? Naruto asked his teammates. I mean, it wouldn't be right, right? Kiba sighed, leaning back onto his hands as he looked up. I dunno, man, he admitted. He's not wrong. I heard from Mom and Hannah that lying about a mission was pretty serious stuff. So what? Naruto asked, a little heatedly, as he smacked his palm into the grass of Tazuna's backyard. These people need our help. We can't just leave them. But Hinata tried speaking up, swallowing nervously. She didn't want to contradict her crush, but there were valid points within Kakashi's arguments. We can't fight people like that. Kiba shot Naruto a critical glance. She's right, man, he agreed. We're not talking a friendly spar, remember? That dude with the sword was pretty serious about cutting us up. We're not ready for that kind of guy. Naruto growled in frustration, ruffling his own hair irritably. Even so, he insisted. We're Konoha Shinobi, right? We're the good guys. We can't be leaving people to their deaths. Hinata and Kiba exchanged looks. They knew Naruto had a point, and frankly, they felt the same way, too. However, they were also both far more realistic about their prospects than their blonde comrade. Naruto sighed, slowly calming down again. He knew both his comrades were right, in a sense. Takeshi and the others' lessons in critical thinking had done wonders for his ability to analyze a situation, and he knew the odds weren't good. Besides, abandoning people just went against everything he believed in. It stood against everything Keisuke and Hayako and the rest of his clan taught him. It went against all that was good and decent and right. And yeah, so what if they were outmatched? So what if the enemy was stronger? Battles had been fought before by uneven forces, and sometimes, the little guy won. Again, that critical thinking kicked in, and he quickly qualified that thought with the sobering knowledge that more often than not, it actually ended in victory for the bigger side. Even so, what use is it being Shinobi, he wondered aloud, staring up at the clear, blue sky, if it just means abandoning people when they need us the most? Kiba and Hinata exchanged looks again, this time both feeling a bit ashamed. Both had been ready to side with Kakashi due to their odds in battle, but the truth was, Naruto's point of view was solid. If they started making excuses now, when would they stop? Would they always run away when outgunned? What did that say about them as people? Kiba shot Hinata a small, tolerant smile before sighing and setting his face into a resigned expression. "Damn, Naruto," he said, faking a little annoyance. "If you're going to say stuff like that, how the hell do you expect me to back down?" Naruto looked up at his friends and widened his eyes as he saw Kiba holding out a fist at him. "I say we stay," his canine friend said with a cocky grin that masked the mountain of insecurities he was feeling right now. "If Kakashi wants us to go, he'll have to drag us back." Hinata nodded fervently, though, not getting the whole fist bump thing, lay her hands on Kiba's outstretched fist and glanced shyly at Naruto. She grunted in agreement. Naruto's look of surprise quickly turned to a happy grin before he extended a fist and bumped with Kiba, all three of their hands now touching. Hell yeah. None of them noticed Kakashi standing near the porch entrance, listening in. Without even saying a word, the cyclopedian ninja vanished back into the house. It was a tense dinner that evening. Tazuna hadn't stopped alternating between drinking heavily and glancing at Kakashi, looking at the man as though he were a coiled snake, about to end his life with a bite. Kakashi, for his part, had eaten his portion in a flash, to everyone's amazement especially since it meant no one got to see him unmasked. Hikari, meanwhile, had softly excused herself upon finishing her meal and offered to take Kimiko's share up to their room, despite Tsunami's protests. Only the frown she shot Kakashi before going up the stairs indicated her displeasure with the Jonin. Tsunami, having noticed the obvious tension in the room, had tried to coax Hinata into talking, but quickly realized that the trainee shinobi was as shy as one could physically get without being a total shut-in, and quickly gave it up as a bad job. Her son, on the other hand, kept glaring at Kiba and Naruto, who seemed eager to beat each other in a food-eating contest. The two male genin were very much aware of the tension in the room, but as Naruto's clan had shown the future clan head, a little levity went a long way to defuse a tense situation. "Better step it up if you think you're going to beat me to that last piece of fish, mutt," Naruto taunted, his words a little muffled by the food in his mouth. Kiba grinned, unaware that there was a bit of seaweed visibly stuck on his left upper canine. "Bring it on, blockhead," he taunted right back. Hinata giggled, despite herself. The exchanges reminded her of the outings the genin pool had done before this mission, when they all just joined in for one big, merry excursion. Their teachers had been ambivalent about it at first, but then quietly encouraged it when they noticed that their team dynamics vastly improved after these interactions. Kakashi sighed. "Please remember that you're guests in this house," he reminded them, though he seemed rather amused by the display. Even so, if Tazuna was right and the country was as predictably impoverished as he implied it was, then this dinner was likely cutting deep into the family's food supplies. Both preteens stopped mid-bite and swallowed nervously before bowing their heads in unison to Tsunami. "Thank you for the food," they chorused, their bowls left clean in front of them. Tsunami smiled kindly at them, though she did seem a little surprised by their appetite. That's all right," she told them. "You're very welcome, boys." Naruto and Kiba raised their bowed heads and grinned before exchanging sudden looks of challenge. "You know what I feel like doing now?" Naruto asked, a little dangerously. "Spar?" Kiba answered, his hands already clenching and unclenching in obvious challenge. Naruto grinned, prompting a similar one from the Inuzuka air. "Damn right," both chorused before snapping their heads towards Kakashi. "Kakashi-sensei. May we go spar?" they asked in unison. Kakashi chuckled briefly before shrugging. "Just don't wander too far off," he said in tacit approval. Both boys cheered before dashing out, leaving Hinata in that very tense room. Kakashi, seeing her fidgeting and glancing at the door the boys had left out of, took pity on the girl. "Go ahead, Hinata. Make sure they don't do anything stupid." Hinata shot a look of surprise, then gratitude, at him and nodded once before politely excusing herself and following the boys out at a much more decent pace. Inari soon excused himself as well, though far more irritably. Judging from the direction he'd stalked off to, Kakashi guessed he was going out to spy on the genin. Good. Maybe he'd catch some of Naruto's infectious optimism while he was at it. Left with Tazuna and Tsunami, however, Kakashi knew the time had come for a decision to be made. Noticing that both men needed to talk, Tsunami softly excused herself and made for the kitchen, under the excuse that she needed to wash the dishes. She carried away none with her. Left to themselves, Tazuna and Kakashi remained silent, though Kakashi was soon aware that virtually everyone who was not in the immediate room seemed to be trying to eavesdrop while trying to remain hidden. As if they could hide from him. Kakashi-san, Tazuna broke the silence at last, obviously unable to restrain himself any further from asking. I have to ask. Did you make a decision? The look on the man's face told Kakashi everything. The man was an open book right now. Despair, resignation, fear, it was all right there, for everyone to see. And unlike many double-crossing clients, Tazuna was utterly sincere with him right now. I have, Kakashi answered after a pregnant pause. But first, I want you to answer something for me. Tazuna sighed. I suppose you've earned that right. Kakashi leaned forward on the table and fixed him with a casual look. Is your daughter single? Tazuna blinked. What? Kakashi shrugged. I figured I'd ask, since it seems we'll be staying here a while. Might as well get to know her and all. Shock, fury, and then relief cycled through Tazuna's face as he processed Kakashi's words. You mean? Kakashi sighed before nodding. Yeah, he confirmed. You might have lied to us, Tazuna-san, but you also had no choice. And I left you here. I don't think I'd like myself very much, he noted, thinking back on his dead teammates from his youth. Obito hadn't left anyone behind, either, and he'd have hated Kakashi for leaving people behind who were in need. So would Rin. That memory caused a painful pang in his heart. Tazuna chuckled incredulously, slowly building up to outright laughter as he barely believed his own good fortune. All around the house, Kakashi's finely tuned hearing caught the whoops of joy from the rest of his team, and a relieved sigh from Tsunami. Without warning, however, Tazuna launched himself at Kakashi and hugged the man, completely uncaring of how unmanly that might have been. Thank you, Kakashi-san, Tazuna said earnestly, before he suddenly began squishing the man with every ounce of strength his years of carpentry had given him. Kakashi started to sweat nervously as the man's hug turned from grateful to painful. But if you touch my daughter, I will kill you. Got it? Kakashi chuckled nervously. Got it. Zabuza hideout, same day, unacceptable. Zabuza growled angrily as Haku offered him a prognosis for his recovery. The fight with the red-headed female had hurt him far more than he'd expected, though, to be honest, he hadn't been expecting a weapon-summoning shinobi. Ever. Haku stood by silently. I'm afraid that's reality, Zabuza-san. The words were spoken softly, but no less sternly for it. You'll need at least 2 weeks of rest to deal with the damage you've received. Zabuza growled again. Of all the road bumps to have hit in his grand plan to have another go at the Mizukage. What of Meizu? And Gozu? He asked, briefly remembering he actually had 3 subordinates. Are they able to fight again? Do you want them to? Haku had a point. The demon brothers were obviously little match for either Kakashi or the red-headed woman with the weapon summons. The other one, too, seemed more than a match for both. Only the genin really had anything to worry about, if they met the two in battle. Fair point, he grunted. Even so, they're good cannon fodder, and they're loyal. Get them back up to fighting ability. We might be able to use them to kill the old man while we take care of Kakashi and his cheerleader squad. I remind you that one of those cheerleaders put you in this condition, Zabuza-san, Haku reminded him sternly. Zabuza growled irritably. He did not need reminding of that fact. Did the midget come by? He asked in a sudden non sequitur, eager to change subjects. His partner nodded again. He did, while you were passed out. He was quite displeased with our performance. Threatened to teach us a lesson if we failed again. Haku paused. I may have sprained his arm when he tried to hit you. Zabuza snorted in amusement. As if Gado's mercenaries could lay on hand on him, much less Haku. The ice-using prodigy's abilities were so high that Zabuza had no doubts that given enough time, Haku would surpass him. Or already did. Fat little bastard, Zabuza grunted. He'll get his, in time. Haku nodded. In fact, if Zabuza didn't need the toad's money so much, he'd have gutted the businessman the day they met, on principle alone. We're going to need intel, he informed his subordinate, who, once again, simply nodded in acquiescence. He really wished Haku would talk a bit more, sometimes. It made it incredibly tiresome to be the sole voice of a conversation. I want you to scout out the enemy. No doubt they're sticking to the old man's house. Figure out their weaknesses, then return to me. Haku bowed. As you wish, Zabuza-san. All right, kiddies, Kakashi announced the next day, standing in the middle of Tazuna's backyard along with his team, seeing as how we're sticking around to try and keep our client and his bridge in one piece, and ourselves alive, it's time to step up your game a bit. All three genin looked at him in some concern at his wording. Kakashi ignored them. Normally, I'd have you tree walk, he told them honestly. As it is, however, I understand you've all been working on that during your free time, he remarked, glancing over at Kimiko, who sat on the porch, watching the group while she rested in her futon. It had taken a hell of a verbal fight between her and Kakashi, but in the end, the red-headed woman had put her foot down and declared that they either helped her move to the porch to watch over her future clan head, or she was going to crawl her way there. Due to the fact that Kakashi knew they'd probably need her help during the inevitable fight with Zabuza, he'd acquiesced and, with Hikari's help, aided the wounded woman onto the porch, where she could keep an eye on Naruto. Not that she'd be any help in a fight, in her given condition. Still, it meant a hell of a lot less arguing, so that was reason enough. So instead, we're going to focus on the fight with Zabuza, he informed them sternly, clapping shut his Ika book and tucking it away. Looking at all three, he saw them giving him the toughest look they could, or rather, confident look, in Hinata's case, and while he felt somewhat moved, he knew he had to nip that overconfidence in the bud. Because let's face it, at this time, you're all dead. The tough looks dissipated, and Hinata looked about to have a fit. Maybe that worked a little too well. You all saw Zabuza, he reminded them. He fought Kimiko-san to a standstill, but he was also at a disadvantage. That's not something he's going to repeat. On even ground, I might have trouble dealing with him myself, he told them rather humbly. Not that he thought it humble, however, as a shinobi, you had to accept that as strong as you were, the cheapest or luckiest shot was all it took to bring you down, and that was an acceptable tactic. If people wanted to fight fair, they joined the samurai. With that in mind, I think a little hands-on combat training is in order, he informed them, sliding into a ready stance, one clawed hand by his waist, the other stretched out and facing the genin. With any luck, you won't need it if we meet Zabuza again. However, just in case, we'll be working on taijutsu. Kiba, you first. Hesitating only a fraction of a second, the feral boy nodded, growled, and launched himself at Kakashi, who easily beat away each one of the boy's attacks. Naruto, well used to this sort of physical beatdown, noticed that Kakashi was greatly holding back, and was, in fact, using completely minimalist movements. Takeshi would have been awed. Your clan relies on aggressive tactics, going for the headlong attack at full strength, Kakashi observed as he batted away each one of the Inuzuka boy's attacks. It makes for great offensive potential, he remarked, before spinning out of the way of another attack and swiping the boy's legs from under him. As Kiba fell, Kakashi spun back to his original position and brought a clawed hand down towards Kiba's chest, stopping only inches away from the laid-out boy's chest. But it's worthless if your offensive strength is less than the opponent's defense, he noted before changing his clawed hand into an offer of help getting up, which the Inuzuka boy reluctantly accepted as he got back to his feet, grumbling at his total defeat. Kakashi seemed to smile at this as he patted the boy on the head. Try being more flexible. Attack when you actually have an opening. Retreat when you're too invested. Find ways around an opponent's skills, not through them. Letting Kiba rejoin his team, Kakashi motioned at Hinata to get ready. The girl had less than a second to stutter and hyperventilate before Kakashi was on her, striking at what would have been lethal spots with short, pinpoint maneuvers that would have put the Hyuga's Juken to shame. Naturally, he kept his hits light and soft, providing the girl with little more than embarrassment as she constantly retreated, throwing the errant Juken strike here and there. Of course, the same goes for clans who rely on defense, he noted idly as Hinata finally jumped away, beat red and feeling humiliated. Playing it safe is well and good, but it's also worthless if you get overwhelmed by an opponent's offensive strength. Again, he patted his pupil's head comfortingly. Don't worry, you're still young, he told her earnestly before walking back to his original spot and looking at all three genin, his gaze stopping on Naruto, the sole member of the team he hadn't humiliated. Be creative. Be sneaky. I don't want you shouting where you are before you strike. And for crying out loud, don't gloat, he told them, deadpanning. Back on the porch, even Kimiko nodded at this pronouncement. I can't count the amount of idiots I've met who've shouted their techniques when there was no need to. Sure, Kuchios and some sealing techniques require an oral component, but if you can avoid letting your opponent know what you're going to do, then he can't really prepare for it unless he's seen it before. Understand? Yes, sensei, all three genin shouted. Kakashi nodded, eyeing Kiba and Hinata. You two will be practicing with me, he informed them before eyeing Naruto, who seemed a little downtrodden at being left out. Naruto, Hikari-san said she wanted to take over your taijutsu training here, under Kimiko-san's supervision. I've agreed to this request, he informed the genin, though he failed to elaborate why. Naruto was predictably confused. He wasn't so dense as to fail to pick up on the tension between Kakashi and his clan. And the way he and Kimiko had been at each other's throats throughout the trip, it was clear that he disagreed with the interference of his clan in his training. So why was he allowing it now? You understand, sensei, he agreed, still wary of this sudden heel turn. Kakashi nodded at him, offering him an apologetic look, at the very least, before looking back at his two other students. You two, he stated. We'll be sparring non-stop for a whole hour. You have that long to land a single blow to my face. If you can't, tomorrow it's 2 hours. Understood? Kiba and Hinata swallowed nervously at the training regimen being offered, but nodded. Yes, sensei, their agreement, this time, was much less enthusiastic. Kakashi nodded before shooting Naruto, then Kimiko a look. I understand Hikari-san wants you to meet her by the beach, Naruto. Go on, then, he said kindly. Naruto eyed his two comrades one last time, taking in their rather visible nerves at having to fight Kakashi for a whole hour, before nodding at his teacher. All right, he agreed before nodding to Kiba and Hinata. I guess I'll see you two later, he said, much of his enthusiasm depleted after learning he wouldn't be training with his friends. Watching Naruto leave, Kakashi sighed as he slid into a combat stance again, this one different from the previous one. He'd wanted Naruto to train with Kiba and Hinata. He thought it important for the boy to bond and train with his team. However, Kimiko and Hikari had both made a convincing case that he also was further ahead, taijutsu-wise, than both, and his progress would be minimal, in comparison. While he regularly tied with Kiba, Naruto was far more clever and cunning by nature, meaning he was less tied down to the dogma of a particular fighting style and thus, more versatile. As such, he would likely benefit more from fighting someone as erratic as a fellow Uzumaki. It wasn't ideal, but considering their current circumstances, he had to agree that it was probably for the best. Naruto found Hikari, alright, but not on the beach. She was on the water. Naruto looked at his cousin, askance, as she sat in a lotus pose on top of the ocean water, looking no worse for wear as the waves rolled under her. Her eyes were closed, her outfit no worse for wear, and she seemed perfectly at peace as she appeared to meditate. He'd never seen her like this. He was no stranger to water walking, of course. Irika could water walk. Virtually every Chunin and Jounin could water walk. Heck, he doubted anyone could become more than a genin if that skill wasn't particularly mastered. However, it was definitely the first time he'd seen someone sit on water. "Oi, Hikari-chan," he called out to her, waving. Lesser shinobi might have broken their concentration and fallen right into the water. However, years of training under Keisuke and the other, older shinobi of the Uzumaki clan had instilled a very well-honed mental discipline in the girl, as befitting of an Uzumaki sealer. She just often chose not to exercise it. Naruto watched her calmly open her eyes, take notice of him, and then push herself back onto her feet, landing softly on the water, not a drop or splash to be seen. "Good, you're here," she said with a grin as she walked over. "What was that?" he asked her, motioning towards the water. Hikari hummed with a sly smile. "Oh, that's something the old man teaches you when you start into the sealing arts," she told him before ruffling his hair. "You're not there yet, though." Naruto grumbled at being treated like a little kid, but accepted the familial gesture with great joy in his heart. It wasn't so long ago that he'd been living on his own, and this sort of gesture would only come from Irika, and maybe the Hokage. To know he had a clan to rely on, a family warmed his heart. "When will I be?" he asked, grinning right back. Hikari laughed before raising her fist for him to bump. A little disconcerted at the move, it took him a second for him to understand her meaning and then bump fists with her, prompting another laugh. "In time, shrimp," she said smilingly. "For now, let's try to get you in shape to survive this mess, yeah?" Naruto nodded, eager to start training, despite a pang of loneliness reminding him that he was training without his friends. "Hell yeah," he exclaimed, punching up into the air. "Where do we start? Sparring? Jutsu?" Hikari merely smiled, grabbed him by the scruff of his shirt, and flung the surprised boy straight into the ocean water, grinning as he yelled out in surprise before making a large splash as he landed. "Water walking," she announced as he resurfaced, sputtering obscenities. "What?" he cried out, dismayed as he swam back to shore. "Why the hell is that important?" Hikari raised an eyebrow. "You questioning me, shrimp?" "Hell yeah he started, only to gasp out for air as Hikari's sandal slammed into his solar plexus, launching him back into the water. For a moment, Naruto thought he'd drown, but then remembered to hold his breath as he swam back up to the surface, only to belatedly realize that Hikari had moved from the shore and onto the water, already swinging her foot at his head. Eyes widening, he quickly dove under the attack and went for her remaining foot, only to miss as she jumped right up, unhindered by the fact that she was effectively fighting him on water. As he resurfaced, he barely had time to gasp for much-needed air before he caught sight of Hikari about to hammer kick him back under. Preempting her, he dove again, this time going for the shore. If he could just reach shore, he'd teach his cousin a thing or two about sucker punching him. He never got there. As he was about to reach the shallow area of the beach, he was suddenly pulled out of the water, swearing in surprise as he felt himself being hoisted up high, Hikari's frowning face greeting him. "That's why it's important," she told him seriously. "Because you're a psychopath," he grouched at her, feeling a little humiliated by the ease with which she'd beaten him up and kept him running about. "If only they'd been on land, because you can't water walk," she corrected him, still keeping him hoisted up to eye level. "Those shinobi we fought were former Kirigakure members, Naruto," she reminded him. "That means that water is their domain. Their kingdom. We're on an island, and you're here to supervise the building of a bridge." Slowly, it dawned on Naruto what she was driving at, prompting him to lower his gaze, a little ashamed with the way he'd acted. Hikari nodded. That's right. Water. You'll be fighting with it literally surrounding you. If you stay the way you are, all those Kirinins have to do is push you off the bridge, and you're out of the fight. Is that what you want? She asked him firmly. No, he admitted a little reluctantly. His expression turned quizzical. But then, why aren't Kiba and Hinata-chan here, too? Hikari made a face. Right now, they're not ready for this next stage, she admitted as she carried her clansman back to shore and set him down. Their fighting styles are too restrictive. Kakashi said they needed to get past that before he made them water walk. But if they work together, then all the enemy has to do is knock one of them out and the other's done for. Hikari interrupted him, sounding as though she'd stated this fact time after time. At the very least, Kakashi, Kimiko-ne, and I all agree on that. The Uzumaki philosophy of combat is to be well-rounded, their clan philosophies is to focus. Naruto looked disappointed by that, but accepted his cousin's explanation without much more fuss. The truth was, most of his protests were based around the idea that he didn't like being separated from his friends, especially not during training sessions, as they'd all grown so used to being with each other and helping one another. Training alone, then, was odd. Bizarre. Uncomfortable. Hikari must have picked up on his growing sullenness, because she shoved him towards the water's edge. Looking back at her, he saw her smiling encouragingly. Go ahead, give it a shot. You know surface walking, right? He nodded. Good. Same principle, but unlike walking up solid surfaces, you're going to need to. Hikari drifted off as she saw his stare turn blank. Apparently, she'd lost him. Sighing, she palmed her forehead and gave him a tolerant smile as she crossed her arms under her breasts. All right, let's try putting it like this, she tried, thinking that perhaps it was best to treat Naruto as she would Natsuo at least, in terms of learning abstract concepts. Have you ever balanced yourself on a rope? She asked. He nodded again, this time following her. She smiled wider. All right. How did you do? He frowned and looked away. Mostly, I fell into the water, he admitted, recalling the unpleasant experience at the academy. Hikari repressed a snort. And those times you didn't fall in? She asked. How did you do that? Naruto shifted from one foot to another, almost unconsciously showing her, rather than telling her. You did this, he explained after a few moves. Hikari nodded. You balanced yourself. You put your weight in the opposite direction of where you were falling. Water walking is similar, she informed him before pointing down at her feet and walking onto the ocean water. Knowing he was still looking at her, she motioned at the water around them. But water isn't like a solid surface, Naruto, she reminded him. It moves, it changes. So how do you use your chakra to stay above that which changes? She asked him pointedly, hoping he'd follow her train of thought and exercise his mind, which was woefully underused. He wasn't stupid, of course, but years of academic neglect meant he was slower on the uptake than his comrades. That was one thing she hoped to help rectify, even if it took years of work. Naruto scrunched his face, cupped his chin, and thought about it. Hikari had told him that balancing on a rope was similar to water walking, and that the water changed. How did they connect? It took him a moment, but the idea steadily grew in his mind, until he grinned as he realized what she was driving at. Pointing at her excitedly, he declared, change. Hikari snorted. Not exactly the declaration she was hoping for, but close enough. Right, she confirmed. Change. When you're walking up a tree or a wall, they don't change, so the amount of chakra you need doesn't either. But water changes, and so must your chakra. Sometimes more, sometimes less, she lectured. Sometimes a little to the left, sometimes a little to the right. It's chakra control, she concluded, smiling at him as she walked back and patting him on the head. It might take a bit, but I trust ya, kiddo, she told him. Go ahead now and try. Naruto nodded and scampered off to the water, wading in until he was shin-high in it. Then, scrunching his face, he brought his hands together and concentrated, pouring as much chakra into his feet as he could. In an instant, Naruto felt himself pulled up as his entire body blasted out of the water, prompting the boy to yelp in surprise and scream as he started his downward trajectory, straight into a deeper area of the water. Hikari laughed as she watched the spectacle, doubling over and causing her long, red hair to shroud her face, and her shoulders shook from mirth. When Naruto resurfaced, she was still laughing. Not funny, he muttered as he swam back to his initial spot. Yeah, it was, Hikari taunted him with a grin as she wiped away a mirthful tear. Oh anyway, too much chakra, she informed him with a grin. Naruto glowered at her and again, closed his eyes and concentrated. This time, however, nothing happened. Too little. Hikari sang. Shut up, he snapped, his right eyebrow twitching as he concentrated a little more. This time, his left leg began rising, but the right one stayed planted on the ocean floor. More balance. If looks could kill, Hikari would have been ashes. 2 hours later, Hikari was still flinging commentary at him, and Naruto was still having trouble maintaining balance for more than a second. Oh! Hikari mock exclaimed, holding up a fist near her mouth as though she were a media presenter. Brave attempt by the contestant, but no dice. It seems he's still unable to accomplish even the simplest T. She easily dodged the thrown kunai. Shut up! Naruto shouted at her, clearly getting more pissed off by the second at his inability to even reach the surface successfully. Lunch, summon Tazuna's daughter, Tsunami shouted from the edge of her property, waving at them. Hikari flashed the woman a thumbs-up sign and then eyed Naruto. Alright, shrimp, time to call it quits for now, she told him, deftly grabbing him by the scruff of his shirt as he tried to dart right for the house. Bored, she quickly added, giving him a rather menacing smile. After lunch, we're coming right back. Kimiko-ne said I could train you till dinner, and then you're hers. Naruto swallowed. Somehow, as tiresome as Hikari's training was already being, he could guess that whatever it is that Kimiko had in mind for him would leave him beat. Well, no one said being Shinobi was going to be easy, right? Tazuna's home, evening, seals. Kimiko nodded at all three genin sitting in front of her, all of them pointedly ignoring the bandages and the fact that she was still sitting amongst the covers of her futon. Kakashi and Hikari had insisted she carry through with the teaching of seals, but they'd also refused to let her leave the confines of her futon. And as she was somewhat injured, relying on her summoned weapons to threaten them to back down wasn't really an option. Yes, she spoke curtly, placing her hands in a modest pose over her lap. Young as you are, advanced techniques will be of little use to you at this juncture, she continued, as blunt as ever. And while I have little hope for Hitaki's ability to raise your fighting abilities, I do believe you can benefit from the art of sealing. Hinata glanced at her two teammates, glad to have the team back together, and then slowly raised a hand, rightly fearing that Kimiko might snap at her. Hyuga-san, Kimiko acknowledged her calmly. Naruto let out a sigh. He didn't know he'd carried. At least Kimiko was trying to be polite. The girl stammered. IS and Toho aren't seals a C-clan's secret F for you, she asked. Kimiko was silent. Then, she raised her head and opened her eyes, looking straight at Hinata. Many, yes, she agreed, giving her a brief nod of respect for bringing up one reason she was so reluctant to teach anything about sealing to anyone except Naruto. But the basics are widely known and practiced, which is what Hitaki and Hikari-san want, she explained. Hinata nodded and slowly lowered her hand. Kiba sighed in relief. He'd been harboring the same doubts as Hinata about being made to listen to another clan's secrets. As powerful as it could make them, the truth was that one of the reasons Konoha worked was because they weren't all trying to backstab each other for their clan secrets. And if he was taught, he was clan-bound to teach his family what he knew, and that would set off a chain of events he'd much rather not linger on. So Naruto spoke up. We going to need brushes or something? Kimiko frowned at her future clan head. It took some effort to remember that Keisuke Koro hadn't begun his tutoring in the sealing arts yet. In essence, she was preempting even her clan elder. She would surely be scolded for it, too, if she didn't do things properly. As such, she shook her head and collected herself. No, she answered him directly. Performing a seal will, in time, require such materials, but you are not even close to that level. None of you are, she stated, expanding her reproach to the whole group, as she felt uncomfortable scolding her future clan head. Sealing is a dangerous and powerful art, she explained calmly, taking great pains to make significant eye contact with all three genin. It can do anything from helping you carry great loads, or summon titanic companions to help you fight. As such, it is an art that must be respected and carefully learned. Even the slightest mistake can cost one's life. She looked to Naruto. You have undoubtedly heard of one such case, Naruto-sama, she reminded him. Naruto's gaze turned blank for a moment, before the memory came to him. Anoka, he said the name softly. He'd never met the Uzumaki clansman, but he remembered how Hikari and the others in the advance guard had looked devastated by the news of her death. Kimiko nodded. Yes, she confirmed. And many others who've given their life to the research of new sealing techniques, or have simply made a mistake, she added. She was pleased when she saw the genin pale a shade. Good. Overconfidence resulted in more deaths in sealing than she liked to admit. So, Kiba started, unsure how to act around the very pretty Uzumaki woman. More than just being good eye candy, he knew from her fight with Sabuza that she could likely crush him with barely any effort. How do we start learning seals? Kimiko fixed the Inuzuka boy with a stare before turning her gaze on Hinata. Through observation, she stated simply before nodding at Hinata. Hyuga-san, please activate your bloodline. Hinata squeaked at being singled out, but complied after exchanging reassuring looks with Naruto and Kiba. Both boys knew that the girl's crippling insecurities had nearly gotten her killed in the last fight, so they'd agreed to show her more support. Yuan, she grunted softly, as her bloodline activated, prompting the ocular veins to bulge on her face. Naruto and Kiba respectfully watched in silence, knowing that the girl had many self-image issues based on the ugliness of her bloodline. Compared to Sakura and Ino, who had no techniques that caused them to deface themselves, Hinata had always thought herself less pretty than she actually was. Of course, such considerations only really ever arose whenever she was in close proximity to her crush. Otherwise, her attention was rather more focused at her perceived lack of shinobi skills. Kimiko nodded, also rather uncaring of the girl's bulging veins. Please observe my chakra system, Hyuga-san, and inform your team of what you see, she prompted. Hinata swallowed as she focused on Kimiko, somehow feeling less intimidated by the woman now that she was basically a collection of chakra coils. There was no emotion, no superficial beauty, just the coils. It saw a normal chakra system, she reported softly. Kimiko nodded. Yes. Now, watch as I perform a simple seal, she ordered as she pulled out a small sealing scroll and laid it out on the floor. Then, flipping through 3 hand seals, she finished on Rat. Fuin, she chanted. Hikari Fuin. Immediately, a burst of light washed over the room, illuminating it better than any candle ever could. To Naruto and his teammates, it was as though daylight had suddenly decided to invade the room, and both boys yelped as their eyes were overloaded. Only Hinata, whose bloodline currently made her immune to the effect, remained unharmed, though she, too, was surprised by what she saw. Nothing, she reported, confused. She hadn't even become aware that all traces of her shyness had completely left her. Precisely, Kimiko confirmed as she watched the boys settle back down, still somewhat whimpering a little too much, in her opinion, at having been blinded by the light seal. Can any of you tell me why that's possible? The genin exchanged glances at the question. The truth was, none of them had any real idea. However, Hinata, in a rare show of courage, slowly raised her hand. Kimiko nodded at her in acknowledgement. Hyuga-san. The chakra came from the seal, she half asked, half answered. Kimiko nodded, prompting a pleased blush from the shy girl. Precisely, she confirmed as she looked, somewhat disappointed, at the two boys. What Hyuga-san has observed is one of the sealing art's most important benefits: virtually no loss of chakra during activation, she stated. While chakra may be used up while creating the seals themselves, activation merely requires an insignificant amount of chakra to start the seal's internal processes. Both boys looked at her blankly. She'd lost them. Feeling a little annoyed at this, she was about to rebuke them firmly for their apparent lack of intelligence when Hinata quickly intervened, having recognized the red-headed woman's irritated body language. It's like pushing a ball down the hill, she explained to her team. Her teammates quickly widened their eyes in realization. Oh! Naruto exclaimed, finally getting it, before tilting his head slightly. Why didn't she say it like that to begin with? Apparently, I may have overestimated your level of education, Kimiko mumbled under her breath before raising her head again and staring down the three genin. In any case, Hyuga-san is correct. She watched as Kiba and Naruto both offered the Hyuga heiress earnest compliments on being smarter than both of them. As expected, however, the girl merely ducked her head shyly and blushed like a ripe tomato. Kimiko frowned. Perhaps trying to involve them in the fighting was a bad idea after all. The Kiri-nin had shown exceptional teamwork, as well as cunning. And while she knew that Hikari was trying to teach Naruto water walking, and Hataki was focusing on the fighting skills of the other two genin, she didn't share their optimism regarding the genin's chances in a real fight against the missing nins. Hell, it irked her to even be stuck doing this. Her plans had been completely derailed. Once they'd arrived in Wave, she'd been planning to use the night to duck out of the bridge builder's home and investigate the country, as Keisuke and Hayako had asked. As it was, however, she was stuck in this piddling home, resting from a rather humiliating wound. A wound that, granted, didn't impair her ability to walk, but would affect her ability to fight, if ambushed by the Kiri Shinobi. In other words, an unacceptable wound. A cough from Kiba caught her attention, and she noticed she'd lost herself in her thoughts, while the genin waited for her to resume her lesson. Clearing her throat, she resumed her lecture. However, despite this advantage, seals have two significant weaknesses because they rely on an internal chakra reserve to work. That means they must be pre-made, or made on the fly, which could drain a combatant or fighter. She corrected herself as she watched Naruto and Kiba blank out, piquing her irritability of vital chakra. Furthermore, seals are typically of single use. As such, seal users, like myself and Hikari-san, usually arrive to battle carrying numerous seals on ourselves. Like your kick-ass jutsu, Kimiko-ne? Naruto asked explosively, practically shooting to his feet as he asked the question excitedly. Kimiko frowned at him. My summoning technique is different, she told him. Please sit down, Naruto-sama, she then admonished him, prompting the boy to plop back onto the floor, disappointed. It is based on seals, yes, but they are of my own design. She looked away then. And forbidden from being replicated by order of our clan elders, she added, sounding a little ashamed, despite herself. Why's that? Kiba asked rather bluntly, forgetting himself. Kimiko's hard stare, however, quickly shut the boy up. That is not the topic of this lecture, she told the trio curtly. Rather, let us begin with our first practice. Whatever excitement lit up in the genin's eyes was quickly dissolved when she then elaborated, meditation. Almost in unison, the trio's shoulders sagged. Kimiko frowned, forcing herself to hold down her annoyance and not lunge and strangle them. All three should be honored to even have this lesson, considering how few shinobi ever bothered to learn sealing or master it. To a seasoned sealer, almost nothing was impossible. You cannot be expected to be trusted with an art as dangerous as sealing as you are, she admonished them, prompting a flinch from the genin. You are undisciplined, emotionally driven. Sealing requires restraint. None of the genin dared to point out that she'd been rather emotional in her fight with the Kirinins. Or that the Uzumaki, as a whole, seemed rather rambunctious for that to be true. By mutual, silent understanding, they all knew that bringing such a thing up would likely mean they'd never see a sunrise ever again. Yes, even Naruto. Kimiko nodded, taking their silence for acknowledgement of her words. Good, she stated, retaining her poise and calm. Please sit in a lotus poise, remain silent, and clear your minds. For how long? Naruto asked, dreading this exercise already. Sitting still had never been his strong suit. Much less being quiet. Or patient. Kimiko stared at him for a moment. For a moment, Kiba wondered if she was trying to set Naruto on fire with the power of her mind. For as long as it takes, Naruto-sama. Meanwhile, odd, Kakashi noted, amused, as he stared up at the ceiling of the living room. I don't hear the kids anymore. Hikari snickered as she flipped a page from her book, an anthology of folk tales from Yuzushio, which she prized above all of her other books. Knowing Kimiko-ne, she's probably putting them through meditative practice, she mused. Cruel, cruel. Kakashi lazily swung his gaze over to the younger girl. Meditation? He asked, curious, before returning his gaze to his own book. Hikari shrugged. Keisuke-sama always swore by it when he taught us sealing, she informed the cyclopedian ninja. Said it gave us discipline and inner strength. But, Kakashi prompted, already guessing where the young woman was going with this. But most of our clan couldn't sit still if you paid them, so he usually went on to teach us seals after the first few lessons, she recalled fondly. She remembered smacking Natsu more than once during such practices, usually because the boy kept trying to break her concentration. Which, in hindsight, she had to admit, he'd succeeded in doing quite often. Think Kimiko-san will be the same? Kakashi asked her. Hikari snorted. As if. She's the only one who actually succeeded her meditation practice. Hikari told him, flipping another page, as her legs swung up and down while she read. As far as she's concerned, the rest of us are all lazy asses. Kakashi chuckled nervously. Perhaps pushing the cold redhead to teach his team seals had been a miscalculation. Maybe you should take over, then, he suggested. Hikari snorted again. Hell no, she declined flatly and without any hesitation whatsoever. Teach those brats? I'm going nuts just trying to teach Naruto-sama water walking. Kakashi stared at her, already starting to regret letting her get her hands on Naruto. Maybe it was time to bring the team back together, and shove these crazy women out? Then, after a moment, she stopped her kicking and turned her head towards him, staring him down with a smile. Kimiko's better than most of us Uzumaki in seals, except maybe for Ag and Maki. They're in good hands. Besides, for all that rough exterior, she's a good teacher, when she puts her mind to it. Speaking from experience? Kakashi asked, feeling a little reassured, he supposed. Hikari smiled. Yeah, she said softly, remembering how Kimiko had often taken the time to correct her younger clansmen whenever she saw them doing something wrong. She always acted like it was a duty more than a favor, but the results spoke for themselves. Then again, she also tended to beat them down like she carried a grudge against them whenever they sparred. Apparently, she also didn't know the meaning of holding back. More than a few clansmen had the scars to prove it. A nearby sound caught their attention then. Hikari flew to her feet, hand already lifting part of her skirt hem to draw a kunai before she stopped to listen more carefully. To Hikari's ears, it sounded much like a pigeon, prompting her to roll her eyes at her own impatience and sheath the kunai she'd been drawing. Kakashi, however, seemed wholly unconcerned, and promptly got up from his spot and walked over to the window, which he slid open. Standing on the external windowsill was a pigeon, just as Hikari had imagined. Konoha? She asked, pulling the hem of her skirt back to a modest position. Kakashi snapped his fingers in disappointment. In his head, of course. He rather liked having genitalia. He nodded as he untied the message from the carrier pigeon's leg and unrolled it. He read it through once, committing it to memory, before destroying it. Confirmation of our orders, he informed her simply. He then reached into his pack for some pigeon food and gave it to the bird as a reward for a job well done. After it ate, it cooed and flew away. Confirmation? Hikari asked, frowning. I thought you said we were staying. You asked for confirmation? Kakashi eyed her for a moment. Of course, he told her simply. I don't know how it's been for you, Uzumaki, but when a breach of protocol this big happens, we have to confirm it with the Hokage, he informed her. Fortunately, he agreed with my assessment, and has given me broad, discretionary powers to see our mission through and renegotiate the terms of our arrangement with Tazuna once the mission is over. Hikari's eyes flickered upwards, where the genin and Kamiko would be. And the kids? She asked. We'll be fine, Kakashi told her simply as he made for the stairs, ready to hit the sack. Like I said, broad, discretionary powers, he reminded her, stopping in front of the stairs to shoot her a look over his shoulder. That's code for whatever is necessary, in case that wasn't clear. Hikari frowned, staring at his back as he went up the stairs. She didn't like the sound of that. It made the Hokage's orders sound like a carte blanche for Kakashi to proceed however he wanted, which, in her mind, was never a good idea, no matter who the person so empowered was. Hikari sighed as she plopped back down on the floor, her book forgotten as it lay beside her. She pinched her nose and rubbed the bridge, a little tired from all the twists and turns this supposedly C-rank mission had taken. What are you doing here? The childish voice caught her off guard, prompting her to jump to her feet once more, her hand again reaching for her thigh-strapped kunai. She was about to skewer whoever spoke when she noticed Tsunami's son standing at the foot of the stairs, looking suddenly afraid of her. She grimaced. Close call. She withdrew her hand and palmed her face. Sorry about that, she apologized to the petrified kid. Caught me a little off guard there, Inari, she tried to recall. The boy nodded, prompting a relieved sigh from Hikari. Another embarrassing moment, averted. She smiled at him then. Aren't you up past your bedtime, kiddo? She asked kindly. Whatever fear the boy had felt quickly evaporated as he realized the girl wasn't about to kill him on the spot, which had brung up rather traumatic memories. Fueled by them, he glowered at her. Shut up, he snapped, taking Hikari aback. You're not my mom. Even shocked, however, Hikari didn't take sass from no kid. Placing her fists on her hips akimbo, she glowered right back. Learn some manners, brat, she retaliated in kind. Didn't your mother teach you any? The boy grit his teeth and looked about ready to stomp away before freezing on the first step. He stood there a moment before glaring back at her. Keep talking, he told her angrily, his small hands curling into fists. You're all dead anyway. Everyone who goes up against Gato dies. That's just the way it is. Hikari frowned. Whatever grudge the kid was holding was a pretty big one. And, seeing as how he seemed to have this sort of attitude, she couldn't rule out the possibility that he was a threat to Naruto and the others. Time for some information. Lightning quick, she flipped through the appropriate hand signs before smiling at the boy's back as he tried to stomp up the stairs. Uzumaki Fuinjutsu, she stated softly, so as to not tip off the others in the house. Kasoku Fuin. The restraint seal hadn't worked on Zabuza, who was far too experienced not to dodge, but Inari was no shinobi. With instance, he felt his body betray him as it froze in place. In another instant, Hikari was right behind him, catching him as he fell back into her arms, having lost his balance due to the jutsu. He looked up at her, anger and fear all over his face. She retaliated with a knowing smirk that sent a chill down the kid's spine. Let's talk, she said simply. The next day, an army of bandits? Kakashi asked Hikari as both of them, plus Kimiko, watched the genin spar in the backyard. Hikari had asked for Naruto to be given the day off from water walking due to some other urgent business, which had prompted Kakashi to agree. The kid seen them, Hikari informed her comrade. They walk around this village, and the others, like they're kings. He's probably exaggerating about the amount, but until we know more, they could be an unfortunate variable in any upcoming fight. Kakashi concluded her line of thought, prompting an agreeing nod from Hikari. Kimiko frowned. This was even worse than she'd expected, and merely served to fuel her desire to go out and explore, as her orders from the elders asked of her. I can go explore, she stated calmly. Hikari sighed, having expected her to offer, while Kakashi shook his head. You're wounded, he reminded her. Exactly, Kimiko stated. I can pass off as one of these downtrodden people better than you could, she pointed out. Plus, she really wanted to go out and explore, but she didn't say that. And unless we get a somewhat accurate reading on Gado's forces, we could be blindsided at any moment. Hikari-san could, Kimiko cut off the jonin. Hikari-san is needed here, training Naruto-sama, she stated firmly. That much was actually true, too. She also wanted to avoid Hikari finding out where they actually were, as per Keisuke's orders. And you need to have the Inuzuka and Hyuga heirs get into shape for the fight. Kakashi frowned, but couldn't deny that logic. And Tazuna? He asked. He's insistent on resuming his work as soon as possible. We need you covering him. No, you don't, she insisted, frowning up at him. You can train the Inuzuka and Hyuga while on the bridge. We need this information. Hikari sighed despondently. As much as I hate to admit it, she has a point, she pointed out to Kakashi, who frowned. Not just because Kimiko was winning this argument, but because she insisted on referring to Kiba and Hinata as the Inuzuka and Hyuga. Fine, he conceded. Try to make yourself less conspicuous, though. The last thing we need is for you to incite a fight well before we're ready, he advised. Kimiko looked about to snap back, but apparently decided against it, settling for merely frowning at him. Of course, she acceded tensely. I'll stick near the house with Naruto-sama, Hikari told Kakashi. Just in case. Kakashi nodded at the much more amiable of the two Uzumaki women. Thank you. Oi, Kakashi. Naruto called out to them at that moment, waving at them wildly. We're kinda done. What now? The three older ninja shared a look before Kakashi sighed and stepped down onto the grass. He paused in his step, however, and turned to glance at the two women. We start tomorrow, then, he told them. Starting the plan now would raise suspicions amongst the townfolk, he then pointed at Hikari. And you. Remember to apologize to Inari. His mom hasn't stopped frowning at us all morning for that little stunt you pulled. Hikari grinned. Oh, come on, she protested half-heartedly. I only scared the bejesus out of him. It's not like I hurt him much. Or even permanently. Or even physically. Kakashi chuckled and waved back at her without care. She was right, of course. From the way Inari now evaded the group like the plague, he was fairly sure Hikari had just scared the crap out of him. Physical injuries would have seen them expelled from the house, no doubt. Yeah, but we're still the good guys. That evening, they're definitely hiding something. Hinata swallowed as Naruto finished his pronouncement. All three genin settled in for the night in their room. Kiba, for his part, nodded, while Akamaru barked softly to show his own agreement. You caught it too, yeah? Kiba agreed. Whatever it is, I don't think it has to do with Sabuza, though. Did you see Tsunami-san's look today? Hinata nodded shyly in agreement. She looked pretty mad, she agreed. And her kid, Inari, I think he has something to do with it, Naruto weighed in. He hasn't been stalking us all day. Not that that's a bad thing, Kiba noted with a smirk. No more, wah. You suck, and wah. You're all going to die, he mocked for a bit, causing Naruto to chuckle a bit before huffing indignantly. Seriously. Talk about a mood killer. He's obviously suffered a lot. Hinata tried to admonish her teammate, but Naruto shook his head at her. So have I, he pointed out flatly, making sure to keep eye contact with her. Hinata had a kind heart, and while Naruto empathized with her wanting to empathize with the kid, he also knew that Inari had to man up already. Safe to say, his comment shut Hinata up immediately, turning beet red in shamed embarrassment. Not exactly what he was aiming for. Sorry, Hinata, but I'm with Goldilocks, Kiba stated gruffly as he rolled over onto his back, prompting an indignant yelp from Akamaru as the pup rolled off his back and rested his head over his hands. I get suffering. I get that. But Tazuna and Tsunami-chan also suffered, right? But they're trying to do something about it, while the brat's just wallowing. He's just a child, Hinata protested bravely, despite her crush obviously feeling less understanding towards the young boy, hoping to make her teammates see reason. We can't expect him to get over it so quickly, Naruto harumphed, but didn't disagree with her. At least, not openly, which was good enough for the team. Silence descended on their room again, only broken every so often by the sound of crickets chirping outside. The blonde knew that his teammates were half expecting him to say something. That was his thing, after all being the rallying cry of the team. During the fight with the Kiri Shinobi, he'd managed to retain enough self-control as to take charge of the trio, even saving Hinata from Kamiko's area attack. But right now, all he could think of was Inari, and that annoyed him. Rather, the boy annoyed him. He wasn't quite sure why, though. He knew the kid was suffering. You had to be blind not to notice that. However, hadn't he, too, suffered? Perhaps to an even greater extent? Even so, even before his clan resurfaced, he'd managed. Maybe not ideally, but he'd managed. So why couldn't this kid do the same? Was he really that different? A part of him did sympathize, sure. But even that sympathy had run its course when he began to realize just how long Inari had been wallowing in his grief. Almost unconsciously, his hands went up to his sternum, where a small necklace, a gift from his cousin Akemi, lay, and he grasped its marble token, carved into the shape of the Uzumaki clan. A reminder, she'd told him, that he was no longer all alone. It warmed his heart then, as it did now. But having a clan was different from having parents. Most his clansmen had their own families. Even Keisuke had his grandson, Raiden. Only Hikari, Kimiko, and a handful of others, including Natsu and Takashi, were orphans. He grit his teeth, his grip on the token getting stronger. The truth was, he did know what bothered him so much about Inari. The boy had his mother, a mother that genuinely cared and worried for him and was forcing her to shoulder the burden of grieving and caring for the family all by herself. The old man at least tried to fix things by going out and building his super bridge, but all Inari did was eat, sleep, and whine. He glared up at the darkened ceiling. The wooden board started to creak a bit as a faint gust of wind picked up. Even the house was, objectively speaking, in dire need of support. And that boy did nothing. It pissed him off. Screw it, he grumbled, sitting up in his futon. He was well aware of his teammates eyeing him silently. I can't sleep. Going out to train, he grunted as he stood up to go do just that. You're going to be dead tired tomorrow, Kiba warned him. Just close your eyes and count to 1,000. Naruto didn't turn to look back at his friends. It doesn't bother either of you, even just a little, he asked rhetorically, missing the exchanged looks between Hinata and Kiba. Kakashi, Hikari-chan, Kimiko-chan, Tsunami-chan, even the old man is doing his best to get us through this mission. And us? We're still acting like it's a field trip. We're genin, Kiba pointed out unhelpfully. Naruto's grasp on the Uzumaki token tightened until his knuckles paled. We're shinobi. The adults can't fight Zabuza at their best if they have to worry about us, he countered, finally turning to look down at his teammates. I don't know about you, but I want to prove to them that we can hold our own. The adults are Inari? Kiba asked perceptively. Naruto looked away, staring at their room's only door. Either. Both, he answered flatly. I'll be back later. Without another word said, Naruto strode out of the room, making sure to open and close the door as quietly as he could so as to not awaken anyone else in the house. Both of his teammates remained in the room, however, with Kiba staring up at the ceiling, then closing his eyes and sighing. Well, damn, Kiba growled as he scratched his head furiously. Akamaru whined in agreement, even as Kiba laid his arms spread eagle and glanced over at Hinata, then the door. Now that idiot's got me fired up. Hinata smiled at her comrade. Kiba had a good heart, however gruff he tried to act. Before long, both genin were out the door as well, eager to catch up with their teammate. And, watching diligently from the roof, Hikari smiled as she saw the team reunite on the beach, exchanging distant words before the two boys bumped fists, with Hinata nodding firmly along, and then wading into the water. Hikari sighed contentedly. Good for them. Wave Country, Tazuna's house, 2 days later splash. Hikari sighed as she watched Naruto fall back into the water, still having achieved little headway into water walking. Not that she was particularly surprised, since water walking at age 13 in just 3 days would be quite impressive, but it still sort of frustrated her. Son of a... Naruto roared angrily as he resurfaced, wading back to the shallows. Before he could finish gearing up for his upcoming swearfest, however, he was beamed in the forehead by a small rock, causing him to stumble and fall into the water again. Language, Hikari chided him casually as he resurfaced. Damn it, stop doing that, the blonde shouted irritably as he resumed his wading back to shore. Hikari smirked. Stop giving me a reason to. Even though she maintained her bright attitude, however, Hikari knew this could be a problem. Zabuza was still lying low, sure, but at the same time, that wasn't meant to be a permanent situation. Eventually, the swordsman would return, and, as Kakashi had deduced, the most optimal battlefield for the missing Nin would probably the bridge proper. If that held true, then that didn't exactly afford the Konoha genin much margin for error. A single misstep, and they'd go headfirst into the water, effectively out of the fight. Nor was abandoning the bridge and forcing Gado's minions to fight on land much of an option, either. As Kakashi once again pointed out, leaving the bridge unattended simply meant opening the door to outright, unhindered sabotage. All Gado would have to do is keep chipping away at the bridge and bleed out Tazuna's investors, until the bridge builder became a financial liability even for Konoha. Still, she'd watched Naruto train with Kiba and Hinata during the night, and it was painfully obvious that he worked much better when he had comrades to lean on or support. Hikari sighed as she watched Naruto scrunch his face and try again, somehow managing to keep one foot half submerged, while the other remained firmly on the seafloor. If only there was a way to speed things up, or rather, if only the Hyuga girl was around. Her Byakugan would certainly come in handy to tell Naruto when and how to balance things out. From the looks of it, that's exactly what her main role had been during the kids' nighttime practice sessions. She briefly considered using altered chakra sealing seals to help him channel less chakra, but immediately dismissed the idea. Not only would Kimiko probably get her for using such a seal to weaken the future clan head, Maki and Eiji would probably join in, seeing as how it was strictly forbidden to alter such seals and use them on a human being without extensive prior consultation and experimentation. And then whatever was left of her would probably be grinded to dust by Keisuke. Damn it. Another splash, another quickly halted swearfest. Hikari frowned and rested her chin on her palm as she stared at Naruto's failing attempts at water walking. Despite knowing it was asking a bit much to have him master water walking in less than a week, she'd hoped he would show the same exponential growth he'd shown when she and the advance guard had first gotten their hands on him. Perhaps this was his wall? So enthralled was she with her thoughts that she never noticed Naruto trudge out of the water and plop down beside her on the grassy overlook until his clothes splashed her a bit with salt water. She flinched as the water hit her, and glared down at the exhausted boy. Giving up already? She snarked. Screw you, Naruto wheezed as he took deep, tired breaths. Hikari chuckled at the sight of him, all tired and frustrated. She remembered many a time when either she or her cousins had been in a similar state. Living on the run, however, pretty much ensured that you didn't dawdle in this way for very long. You know we can't really advance if you don't get this down, right? Hikari noted absently as she looked over at the sea, its waves gently rolling and crashing into the sandy beach. Naruto groaned. Kami, he whined. This is almost as bad as when Maki-chan used me as a guinea pig. Hikari giggled, remembering quite well how Maki had gone all crazy scientist mode on Naruto when she discovered he could use shadow clones. Hikari slammed her palm against her forehead, causing Naruto to jump in surprise at the vehement force behind said facepalming. What the hell, Ne-chan? He cried out in surprise. She ignored him as she glared into her palm, unwilling to believe she was this dense. Maybe she'd been spending too much time around Natsu, and his idiocy had rubbed off on her. Yeah, that must be it. There's no way she was this dense on her own. Kage Bunshin, she muttered as she dragged her palm over her face and right off her chin. Leaning back, she quickly flipped up onto her feet and spun, pointing right at her future clan head. Up, she barked. Seeing that Hikari was really not in the mood for any backtalk, he quickly complied and, without consciously realizing it, stood at attention, arms firmly set at his sides. Shadow clones, she stated again, this time clear and for Naruto's benefit. How many can you make? Naruto frowned. What, you mean like that time with that bastard, Mizuki? Hikari shook her head. I mean, usually. Naruto shrugged. Well, at a time, I guess 20 or 30. If I'm rested, 40 to 50, he mused, clearly trying to think this one through. If I'm mad, I think over 70, he added with another shrug. Really, as long as I keep it staggered, I can keep making them pretty steadily. Hikari guessed he could do a whole lot more than 60 when he was angry, and had a fairly decent hypothesis as to why, but decided not to even try pushing that. Neither she, nor Kimiko, nor Kakashi were in any way, shape, or form ready or trained to attempt containment of the Kyuubi. For now, whatever Naruto could come up with without using his other chakra would have to suffice. Plus, she had a theory to test out. Make 10, she ordered in a clipped tone. Don't do anything with them. Just make 10 and stand still. Naruto blinked in confusion, wondering where she was going with this. Usually, Hikari never asked him to stay still. She was too busy slave driving him from one workout session to another. Making the plus sign with his hands, he closed his eyes, summoned his chakra, and did as he was told, silently summoning 10 shadow clones to his side. Hikari frowned at him silently for a moment. Were they going to play a staring game, or something? What was the point of this, Naruto wondered. How do you feel? She asked cautiously. Naruto's eyebrow twitched in irritation. Bored. Confused. Fearing for your sanity, he sniped. He was soon flicked on the forehead by an equally irritated Hikari for his troubles. Ow. Damn it, Ne-chan. Behave, she told him flatly before crossing her arms under her chest and fixing him with her best drill master glare. Now, answer the question. How do you feel? Naruto glared right back. Tired, he reluctantly admitted. Hikari nodded absently before pointing to the ocean. Go try again. Naruto stared at her unbelievingly for a moment before shrugging and moving back towards the ocean, his clones in tow. This was soon brought to a halt, however, when Hikari made a few hand seals, stomped on the ground, and several restraining seals appeared to keep the clones frozen in place. Naruto practically jumped out of his skin at the sudden, belligerent act. What the hell? He cried out as he stumbled back, his feet sloshing in the salt water. No clones, Hikari stated flatly. Just you. Try again. Naruto goggled at her, truly fearing for her sanity this time. What was up with her? He'd expected her to order him to use the shadow clones the same way Maki had, but instead, she seemingly expected him to do all the work without them. Not that it made any difference, since he still couldn't regulate his chakra worth a damn. Hikari seemed to understand his skepticism towards her plan, and merely nodded at him with a reassuring smile. Trust me. Try again. Naruto stared at her silently for a moment before sighing, shrugging, and going deeper into the water, until it was shin-high. Eyeing his stricken clones one last time, Naruto closed his eyes and focused on his chakra, getting it to accumulate at his feet. For some strange reason, he actually found it easier, this time around. Then, raising one foot up above water, he pressed down onto the surface and, to his utter amazement, felt it actually take hold. His eyes shot wide open and, instinctively, he tried to press down on his foot, only his concentration was now thoroughly broken, causing him to stumble forward and fall face first into the water in a rather loud splash. While Naruto resurfaced ready to curse the heavens, however, Hikari's frown had turned to a satisfied smile, as though seeing Naruto's latest failure had proven her theory correct. It had. Moments later, she had Naruto and his clones sitting lotus-style in front of her, her best lecture mode activated. What do you know of the law of inverse control? She asked him simply, her hands on her hips akimbo. Naruto blinked blankly. It had a rather eerie effect when his clones did the exact same thing, in sync. Hikari shuddered at the sight before remembering that it was probably necessary to teach Naruto as though he were of Natsu-level intelligence, which paid compliment to neither. The more chakra you have, the less pinpoint control over it you're going to be able to have, she informed him as she wagged a finger. That's your problem, brat. You're on the right track, but you use so much chakra that you might as well not be using any at all. Naruto cocked his head to the side, frowning. He followed where she was going with this, he thought, but he didn't quite see how he'd been able to grip the water with his foot this last time, then. How much chakra does a Kage Bunshin have, Naruto? Hikari then asked him, preempting his question. The same as Mirai? She shook her head. Each clone possesses a fraction of your chakra directly proportional, she saw him blanking out and sighed. Relative to how many you make. So, Naruto prompted slowly, still not really getting it. Hikari restrained the urge to plant her fist into his head. So if you have 10 clones, and each one has to have the same amount as you, then your chakra has been split 11 ways, counting yourself. So? Naruto repeated, feeling a picture developing in his mind, but not quite there yet. So if the amount of chakra was the reason you didn't have proper control, then less chakra means you should have more control, Hikari reasoned. She wanted to hit herself, though. She couldn't believe she'd forgotten about this ability. Maki would have kicked her ass, no doubt. Naruto, too, seemed ready to smack himself. He knew, for a fact, that he felt a little weaker every time he used shadow clones, but the significance of that feeling had never really registered with him. Hikari wasn't one for wallowing in self-pity, however, and simply pointed back at the water. Make 10 more, then try again. This time, with your clones. Hopefully, we can speed things up a little. Naruto nodded firmly, already making the appropriate hand seal. Right. On the bridge, Hinata. And the Hyuga heiress acknowledged as Kiba fell back, launching herself at Kakashi, one palm already drawn back, ready to snap forward and nail the Jonin in the midriff. Kakashi seemingly ignored her, his gaze fixated on his book. Even so, he deflected the palm easily, his left leg already mid-swing as it raced to impact her unprotected side. She'd overdrawn herself again. Kiba, however, was quick on the uptake and, forced to fight without Akamaru, intercepted the kick for Hinata by pulling her back and taking her place, managing to make the kick turn into a glancing blow against his upper bicep. He still grimaced, however, as even a low-powered kick from Kakashi was substantially stronger than he was used to. Kiba-kun. Hinata cried out as she slid back onto her haunches, watching her comrade still get flung to the side by the weakened kick. Kakashi wasted no time, however, and spun on his heel, ready to fire off another kick at his reeling subordinate. Only to jump at the last second as Hinata attempted to slide tackle his pivot foot off the ground. All this accomplished, however, was for Kakashi to flip in the air, extend his non-reading hand, and pin Hinata to the floor by the neck as Kiba started to recover. Time, Kakashi stated calmly as he let go of Hinata and helped her up. He eyed Kiba for a moment. That was good teamwork, he acknowledged, deciding he had to give them that much, at least. But you're still overdrawing yourselves, he then chastised. He nodded at Kiba. Kiba, you've improved your defensive skills, but you're still trying to use your durability as your main defense. That's a mistake. He shifted his gaze to Hinata then. Hinata, your attack strategies and instincts are getting better, but you're still following your target's pace, rather than setting your own. Control the fight, or it'll control you. Both students nodded, still breathing heavily from the exertion. Kakashi had to hand it to them ever since that second night. His genin had been really fired up to train, for some reason. Even meek little Hinata had insisted on training well past her usual exhaustion point. And, according to Hikari, Naruto was pretty much the same, driving himself well past his limits just to cram in another few hours of training. Take 15 minutes to rest, and we'll go through the katas again, he told the kids then, smirking under his mask as he saw them collapse on the ground, heaving grateful sighs as they finally took a breather. Akamaru, seeing that the fight was over, quickly trotted over and licked his partner's face, a form of canine comfort, he assumed. Walking back to Tazuna, who was hard at work overseeing construction, Kakashi noticed that more than a few workers had stopped to watch the spar, probably the first time they'd seen Shinobi train. Even so, he caught the occasional expression of what seemed like nostalgia. Which was odd, if you thought about it. Wave Country had no hidden village to speak of. I see the brats are working super hard, Tazuna greeted him idly as he examined the construction plans in his hands and motioning to one worker. Ishida. A little more to the left, he barked. Kakashi watched said worker do as he was told, but otherwise made no move to show he'd heard Tazuna, except to flip the page in his book. They take their work seriously, he said simply. And I appreciate that, Tazuna told him earnestly, still fixated on the plans. Especially after he lead to you and all. Kakashi flipped another page. You were desperate. I get that, he stated. Still, you do know that Konoha's going to be asking for a new deal to make up the rank difference, right? Tazuna's shoulders sagged. Yeah, I figured, the bridge builder muttered. How much? Kakashi shrugged. Dunno yet, he answered calmly, wisely keeping to himself the fact that he would be the one in charge of making that decision. I'll let you know. Tazuna huffed, but conceded the point. Meh. As long as the bridge gets built and Gato's hold is broken, y'all can bleed me dry for all I bloody care, he grumbled. Kakashi regarded the man silently. Saying as much had, amusingly enough, caused Kakashi to regard the old bridge builder somewhat more highly, causing him to lower his predicted price increase. If the old man kept it up, he might even forego some of the more strict trading rules he was going to suggest to the Hokage. Honorable dispositions ought to be rewarded, after all. Still appearing to be reading, he checked out the bridge's progress. Though Kakashi had forced Tazuna to wait a day after his return to resume construction, it was still nonetheless faring quite well, perhaps even going ahead of schedule. Though, to ensure that as much of it was done as possible, he was starting to wonder if he should order Naruto to create a few shadow clones to help out. Even if their resilience wasn't worth writing home about, having the extra pair of hands could only really help. His gaze slid over to his other two students, who were at least sitting down now, apparently engrossed in another impromptu strategy session, and by strategy session, he meant Kiba firing off wild ideas and Hinata tempering them down into a workable plan. Good. At least they had the drive to improve. His thoughts turned to his other, absent student. From what Hikari was telling him after dinner every night, Naruto's progress with water walking had been slow, somewhat reinforcing his belief that perhaps he should retake control of the blonde's training. He could appreciate the strategic considerations behind Hikari's desire to have the boy learn water walking so soon, but as Naruto was part of a team, it seemed only logical that his greatest priority be to work as part of one, not train by himself. Kakashi sighed mentally. Well, at least Hikari was easier to deal with than her older cousin. Unlike the bubbly redhead, Kimiko was about as personable as a solid block of ice, and her attitude, which had been waning a bit in the days before they'd reached Wave, had suddenly taken a heel turn for the worse after she'd begun exploring Tazuna's village. While none of Gado's men had made her, Kimiko's return the 2 previous afternoons were heralded by a foul, almost permanent glare on her face and incredibly tensed-up muscles, as though she was restraining herself from causing mass property damage. Whatever she was finding that was pissing her off, however, she refused to say, merely sticking to the relevant details that would benefit their assigned mission. It was such a pity, too, Kakashi mused. However difficult Kimiko was, she was easy on the eyes, and he could appreciate the firepower she brought to the team. If only her attitude would soften up, he had no doubts she would be an incredible asset to the mission. As it was, however, he was beginning to consider filing her under potential imminent threat in his mind's archive of notable shinobi. Only knowing that Naruto and Hikari would probably never forgive him if they found out really stopped him. For all of the blonde's uncouth behavior, he demonstrated a genuine desire to learn from Kakashi and his peers, and seemingly looked up to him, despite Kakashi's self-avowed bad habits. Hikari, for her part, had been nothing but nice and amiable during the trip, also helping quite a bit in soothing Kimiko's strained temper. Kakashi sighed as he rolled an eye upwards, glancing up at the bright, blue sky, a few errant clouds drifting westwardly thanks to the sea currents. He supposed situations like these did happen on occasion, especially in their line of work, and he just had to deal with it as best he could. As irritating as that could be. And who knew? Maybe Kimiko would finally get over whatever was stuck in her craw. He snorted as he flipped to the next page of his book, a slight blush creeping up on his cheeks as he reached another of Jiraiya's masterfully written erotic scenes. As if he'd probably have more luck following Tsunade's lead at a gambling den. Kimiko's room. The next night Kimiko was honestly glad the kids had left when they did, after tonight's lesson in seals, or rather, another round of failed meditation, after she'd educated them on the 2 types of sealing, active and passive, and their different relationships with chakra. She'd been hanging on the edge of her temper for a while there, and was honestly wondering if perhaps dealing with the 3 genin would finally make her lose her cool. Which she knew would be somewhat unfair to the kids, but they'd simply had the misfortune of being the closest targets for her to vent at the time. Fortunately, it never got to that point, despite Naruto and Kiba fidgeting and complaining so much she'd been tempted to employ grave bodily harm as a teaching tool. Again, it had worked against the other Uzumaki clansmen, after all. Potential child abuse aside, Kimiko glared up at the ceiling as she dwelled on the actual cause of her boiling anger. Ever since she'd taken on the task of exploring Tazuna's village, ostensibly to perform recon on Gado's local operations, all she'd found were greater and greater reasons to fly off the handle and just lay waste to everything in sight. Dejected people, ruined village, and petty thugs strutting about as though they owned the place. Which, she had to concede, they sort of did, all things considered. Still pissed her off, though. But what grated her even more, however, was the village's reaction to their destitute, oppressed lives. Acceptance. Pure, unadulterated acceptance. Or rather, resignation. Either worked. The point was, they were willing to just lie down and take their petty tyrants' whims and live and let live. She didn't see an ounce of resistance in their beings, and that truly rubbed her the wrong way, especially given what she knew about this land. Hell, she'd listened to the old man tell Kakashi how more and more local workers were beginning to abandon the bridge's construction, apparently because they didn't want to cross Gado or his goons. Never mind that, statistically speaking, the people Gado oppressed probably outnumbered their oppressors by several significant orders of magnitude. If they'd had the balls, she had no doubts they could have risen up in rebellion and brought down the corrupt businessmen. But not Hay just lay there and took it, like some Turio whore. She glared fiercely at the ceiling. A very significant part of her wanted to hunt down Gado and his men and skewer them, but she was under strict instructions from Keisuke to not interfere. All she was supposed to do was observe, protect Naruto, and report back with her findings. She'd thought herself capable of handling that burden, but now she wasn't as sure. The urge to cut loose was growing more and more unmanageable with every sob story she heard and every act of pathetic resignation she saw. Hell, even Tazuna's family had caught the bug, if that boy Inari was anything to go by. Tsunami and the old bridge builder might still have a bit of fight in them, but the kid was a lost cause. And no, she didn't care he'd been traumatized by the public torture and execution of his stepfather. She'd gone through worse, and she had the wounds to prove it. Even so, she'd crawled and clawed her way back into fighting shape, and taken her revenge for the slights against her disproportionately. All the sympathy she could muster for this village came in the form of regret that she couldn't have met this Kaiser fellow. Unlike everyone else, what she'd heard of the man had earned him her respect. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, he'd stuck to the good fight to the bitter end. The problem was, as angry as she knew she was, and as dangerously close to her snapping point as she was getting, could she really continue performing her duties competently? As proud as she wasn't stupid. She knew that if she let herself get worse, she'd become a liability, rather than an asset, to not just this team in particular, but perhaps even her clan. People who became like that within the Uzumaki, and there had been cases, tended to get benched. For good. It was one of the reasons Akemi seldom left the compound for missions anymore. Another episode like the one she'd had years ago, and Kimiko shivered. As powerful as she was, Akemi had demonstrated being a class above her in that one instant. Fortunately for everyone, however, the young woman had since basically retired as a shinobi and had settled for teaching younger generations and running the clan bar. And being Keisuke's occasional agent in the field. Granted, whenever that happened, it usually heralded important or catastrophic things to come. Case in point, the last time Akemi had hit the field, she'd confirmed Hikari's report on Naruto's existence, thereby bringing about enormous change to the clan. The thing was, Kimiko had no intention of leaving fieldwork. Her pride her anger demanded that she protect the clan as best she could, by taking out its enemies. She couldn't do that from within the confines of the clan compound. So she was now faced with the problem of managing to rein in her temper for a while longer, hopefully long enough for Tazuna to finish his bridge and Kakashi to lead the team back to Konoha. Then she could request a good bandit clearing job and finally cut loose. Well, at least she had Hikari's good news to rely on. Apparently, ever since they'd rediscovered the use of shadow clones as a training tool, Naruto had been making a few leaps in water walking, even though he was merely using about a baker's dozen at a time. If it had been her in charge, she would have made him summon as many as he could. Kimiko sighed as she laid the back of her hand on her forehead, staring quietly up at the battered roof. The future clan head gave her mixed feelings, something she hadn't felt in quite some time. She wasn't, by any means, surprised by his personality. The clan had more than a few happy-go-lucky types running around. Rather, it was his innocent insistence that everything would work out fine. That blunt, unrefined optimism that everyone had a chance to be good. It was naive. It was absurd. It was nice. She frowned, banishing those thoughts from her mind. However nice those feelings might be, she couldn't accept that childish innocence in a clan head. Too much trust had led to the downfall of Yasushio. Too much reliance on their allies had deprived them of the necessary paranoia to see the writing on the wall when the allied enemy nations converged on Yuzu. Naruto had to grow up. He had to see that the world wasn't cute and cuddly and full of good things. As determined as he was to protect his team, she knew that if the enemy gave him but a minor reason to empathize with them, the boy would seize upon it in a heartbeat. Such empathy was to be commended in a civilian. In a shinobi, it was just a quick way to get yourself killed. She had blunted her own emotions, relied on her pain and anger to fuel her distrust of others. She knew it gave her a bad or unapproachable image she didn't mind. If people thought her own clan feared her, then they would fear her too. And through that fear, she would keep the enemies of the Uzumaki at bay. She reached for her necklace, its small, spiral icon resting between her clavicles. She grasped the small, jade construct tightly. The Uzumaki were her clan. The clan was everything. She would protect the clan, even if it meant being hated by all. That was her role, her duty as its protector. Zabuza's hideout. The next day Zabuza frowned at his disciple as he slowly gripped and released an apple in his hand. At the moment, he could do little more than impress his fingers into the fruit's outer layer, but the goal was to eventually crush it with a single hand with ease. Only then would he be within reasonable condition to fight again. Even so, he was not exactly pleased with how the preparations for said fight were coming along. "This is remarkably little information you've given me, Haku," he informed his apprentice as the masked shinobi remained kneeling before Zabuza's bed. "My apologies, Zabuza-san," Haku apologized plainly, unafraid to admit to failure. "Unfortunately, the bridge builder's home is better guarded than I'd anticipated. Furthermore, the genin remain under strict, constant supervision by either the girl with the giant scroll or Hataki-san." Zabuza frowned up at the ceiling, applying a little more pressure to the apple as his irritation grew. "And the woman who injured me?" he asked bluntly. "She wanders the town," Haku informed him calmly. "She asks a lot of questions about Gato and his operations, though she's also prodded into the local history." Zabuza snorted derisively. "Crazy woman. Who'd want to know more about a dirt hole like this?" "So she's scouting out the opposition," he deduced nonetheless, pressing his fingers into the apple a little more. "Clever. Perhaps she is attempting to deduce our whereabouts, for a preemptive strike?" Haku suggested. Zabuza shrugged. "Maybe, but I wouldn't bet on it," he stated neutrally. "There's only so much you can do and find out in a nothing village like the bridge builders. If she was hunting us down, she'd have left the village long ago. Perhaps her wounds are the reason why. In which case, Kakashi or the other girl would have come out to scout for us," Zabuza refuted, frowning as his latest attempt to squash the apple caused a burst of sharp pain to shoot up his arms. He made no mention of this, however, and merely kept quiet, something he'd learned in his shinobi days. The more noise you made, especially in regards to pain, the bigger the target you were. Even so, he knew better than to keep his discomfort from Haku. "My wounds are acting up," the former swordsman of the Hidden Mist informed his disciple as he shifted in his bed. "Got any more of that anesthetic?" "I'm afraid not, Zabuza-san," Haku apologized. "I used most of my reserves healing Gozu and Meizu for the upcoming fight. Fortunately, however, it is easily enough to replace. The necessary flowers are all rather common in this land." Zabuza frowned and shifted again, more than a little irritated by the pain. "Do it," he grunted. "I need to get to 100% as soon as possible, or else that goddamned midget's gonna be insufferable and I might have to finally kill him on principle." Haku said nothing at that, though Zabuza knew his disciple didn't need to. Zabuza knew very well that the youth would not object to Gato's untimely demise, due in no small part to the fact that Gato was a well-known human trafficker and drug runner amongst the underworld. Having been subject to the horrors of the bloodline purges in the Hidden Mist, Haku knew better than anyone what kind of monster the midget really was. Naturally, his disciple made sure he knew of this displeasure at every opportunity. Still didn't negate the fact that the diminutive businessman had the money and the resources Zabuza needed for his next go at the Mizukage, however. Zabuza watched as his apprentice left him alone, and returned his thoughts to his confrontation with the strange, red-headed woman. Weapons specialists were nothing new. There were many shinobi who, failing to excel in ninjutsu or taijutsu, had turned to being masters of a variety of weapons. What was different, however, was the way in which the woman had accessed her weapon. He'd seen weapon masters use scrolls to store and release weapons, and predictably, that was a highly inefficient way of fighting. What the woman had done, however, was summon the weapon not from a scroll, but from her own body, something unthinkable. He might not have paid much attention to his sealing classes, but he knew enough about the art that body sealing was extraordinarily frowned upon, if not outright banned. He could see the advantages in it, however. Unlike scroll sealing, body sealing meant 247 access to the seal's abilities and quick retrieval, if you knew what you were doing. And the way the woman had used her seals, she'd gotten access to a high-powered weapon in a split second, extremely convenient for someone who depended on a range of weapons. But body sealing, he knew, had its significant drawbacks, which he was sure the woman had to know about, because for her to have access to such abilities in such a convenient fashion meant that she'd done the sealing once she'd hit the final straight of her growth spurt. Or she was bug nuts. Either was a likely possibility. The point was, she was a wild card. The other girl had seen the straight-up summoner specialist, what with the huge scroll and all, and he knew enough about Kakashi to understand the man's standard M.O. The hammer-wielding one, however, she remained an enigma. And not just because of her abilities, either. Zabuza had been ANBU long before he was a missing nin, and he could recognize hatred in another person's eyes as easily as any man with eyes can tell if the sky is cloudy or not, and that woman had hated him. Not just disliked him, hated. In fact, he would go as far as to say that if she'd had a chance, she'd gut him on sight regardless of any mission. Which was weird, because he liked to think he knew all the women he'd pissed off to that point over the years. He frowned. Another reason to berate Haku for failing in discerning enough information on their opponents. If he didn't know what bone the woman had to pick with him, how the hell could he try to predict her moves? He frowned. His back was starting to itch, and he was under strict orders not to move around, lest he aggravate his back injuries. Instinctively, he turned his head to call out for Haku, only to stop as he realized his apprentice was long gone by now. The itch got worse. Damn it. Later that day, in town, Naruto yawned in utter boredom as he waited for Hikari to finish her errand inside the store behind him. After Kimiko had finished her scouting, she'd apparently strained herself a tad too much, prompting a relapse in pain, and thus provoking this sudden outing into the town. As Kakashi remained at the bridge with his two other genin and the bridge builder, Hikari had been the obvious choice. But with Kimiko's combat effectiveness compromised, that meant she wasn't exactly in the best of conditions to protect the blonde boy in the event of a sudden attack on the house, not that anyone except Kimiko was expecting one, by this point. Either way, the only rational compromise had been that Hikari take Naruto into town with her as she looked for some medicine. Another clansman might have been able to collect the necessary medicinal plants from the nearby woods, but Hikari had to admit that she sucked something awful at brewing medicines. Much simpler to just buy them, she thought. And considering Kimiko had dedicated her entire life to the martial arts, rather than healing, suffice to say, buying the medicine had been the obvious choice. Except that Naruto was now faced with an incredible faux boredom. With his training session with Hikari cut short, he was frankly bored out of his mind as he went with her from store to store in this decrepit little village looking for some pain medication. Most of them focused on foodstuffs, which Hikari had told him was rather logical, considering their miserable lives or farming fishing materials, and as their search dragged on, Naruto was starting to believe that perhaps these people had no access to medicine. Fortunately, he was proven rather wrong. After the fourth shop turned them away, Hikari finally struck gold with a random passerby, who directed her somewhat reluctantly, both Uzumaki noted, to a nearby warehouse, where a sizable line of people could be seen stretching well beyond the door and into the street proper. A few quick questions revealed that things like medicine or other specialty items were closely controlled commodities, and the only way to access them was via Gato's stores. By consequence, the man had a virtual monopoly on the items, allowing him to charge as much as he wanted. Of course, the key to a good monopoly wasn't to extract every single penny a person had, but rather keeping prices low enough that people would still pay, while high enough to effectively double or triple one's profit margins. If one charged too high out of overconfidence, as any businessman could attest, all that really engendered was resentment and, eventually, insurrection. Either way, faced with no other choice, Hikari had opted to queue up, waiting patiently as the throng of customers before her slowly advanced into the store. Naruto, for his part, opted to remain outside, not really liking the idea of taking up unnecessary space in what was obviously an already quite cramped store. All he had to do was promise Hikari he'd never tell Kimiko that he'd been out of her sight when they got back. A reasonable demand. Odds were, the elder girl would kill both of them for such a breach in security protocols. Either way, it meant he now had some time to kill while his cousin suffered the hell that was waiting in line. Again, he yawned in boredom. Were it Konoha, he would have just wandered around and come back 15 minutes later. Unfortunately, this town wasn't Konoha, which meant two things: it wasn't safe, and there was nothing to really see or do. As Kimiko had reported, the town was a decrepit wreck. Not a house, or rather, shacks had gone by as they'd walked the dirt streets that didn't need emergency repairs or had a significant amount of its roof or walls patched up hastily. While the people themselves weren't so poor as to wear tattered pieces of cloth just yet, Naruto and Hikari both knew that it was a matter of time before the patchwork kimonos and hakumas were too expensive to repair. Which isn't to say that there wasn't some form of life in the town. Children still played in the streets and people still walked and talked all over, but the atmosphere was noticeably somber, and whenever a patrol would come by, the streets would clear in a heartbeat. In addition, conversation was basically non-existent between the Konoha Nins and the populace. Despite their disguises, everyone seemed to know that they were outsiders, and while they weren't turning them into Gado's thugs, it didn't mean they tried to associate either. If Naruto had to venture a guess, they were trying to keep their distance in case Gado suddenly developed the urge to go after them. Sad, but wise. Sighing, Naruto looked up at the clear sky, watching the slowly wandering clouds. Shikamaru loved doing this, but Naruto had never really gotten the hang of it. Clouds were just clouds to him, and the sky, well, sure, it had its pretty quality, but it was still just the sky. Stargazing with Hikari hadn't changed his mind on this either, much to his cousin's disappointment. He could appreciate the beauty of a clear, night sky, but it didn't exactly move him. Sighing again, the blonde, though, arguably, he was now dark-haired, thanks to an ointment Hikari had produced for just such occasions, slid down the store's wall and decided to try and get in some meditation training. Kimiko had been quite irritable these past few days, and every time he and his friends failed to meditate properly, it seemed to add to her irritability. Closing his eyes, there was no need for a lotus position. According to Kimiko, he tried to clear his mind, envisioning nothingness. He managed to keep that state for about 3 seconds before, again, his concentration broke. Not due to his hyperactivity, mind, but due to something else. He'd found that every time he attempted to meditate, he would feel a tug at the back of his nape, apparently trying to pull him down. Each time, it broke his concentration, and yet when he snapped his eyes open and whirled about to see who'd interfered, he saw his friend staring at him oddly and Kimiko frowning at him. No one had touched him. He wasn't crazy. He knew what he felt. Telling Kimiko about it had prompted a confused look from the older girl, before she reasoned that perhaps it was a physiological reflex of his, due to his hyperactive nature. After seeing he hadn't gotten that explanation, she clarified that she thought perhaps his body was unconsciously unwilling to sit about, breaking his concentration. Asking Hikari had prompted a shrug and a wary agreement of Kimiko's assessment. She promised to inform Keisuke when they got back, to see if perhaps there was something else at play. Briefly, he'd wondered what other reason there could be, but those suspicions were put to the side until she saw Hikari quietly discussing something, with some obvious intensity, with Kakashi, who kept trying to glance discreetly at him. Naruto had the distinct feeling that he probably wouldn't like whatever it was they were discussing, and left it at that. Predictably, then, his latest foray into meditation failed just as miserably, though he was a bit surprised to feel the tug take greater force this time around. like he as though it was gathering strength. But that was crazy, right? Are you alright? Naruto snapped open his eyes, hand already going for a kunai, when he stopped cold, seeing a pretty girl looking down at him curiously. Not as pretty as Sakura, of course, but still quite pretty. She was looking at him quite curiously, raven hair split to frame her delicate face, pale skin and rosy lips serving to give her a very cute appearance. In fact, if Naruto hadn't been taken so off guard at the sudden appearance of such a woman, he might have wondered how on earth such a girl could live here and walk about freely, considering the rough nature of Gato's thugs. Huh? He asked instead, a bit dumbly. Blinking as he processed the girl's question, he shook his head slightly and flashed her his brightest grin. Yeah. I'm good. Why? He asked, cocking his head to the side, a little curious and rather intrigued by this town girl who'd actually made contact with him, as opposed to the wary shunning of the rest. The girl emulated his slight move of the head to the side and smiled back. You were quite still there, for a moment, she informed him, keeping her hands out of sight behind her back. I was worried you'd passed out or died. Naruto blinked. Why? He asked. That seemed like an odd observation to make on first sight. Wasn't it much more logical to assume he'd been drunk? The girl cocked her head to the other side, staring at him curiously. Aren't you from Wave? She asked, as though that answered his question. It did. Naruto quickly connected the dots and gave a nervous laugh as he rubbed the back of his head and shot to his feet, prompting the girl to take a surprised step back at the sudden move. A more observant shinobi might have noticed that the girl's move had been rather smooth for a civilian. Even so, the girl had nearly managed to blow Naruto's cover as some other wave transient. Locals would, of course, have known that there were more than a few cases of malnourished or sick persons dying on the streets, and so having someone ask if you were alright would have actually been quite logical. Yeah, of course I am. Naruto insisted, sweating a little as he cursed himself for nearly blowing his cover. Just not this town. You know, he added, somewhat lamely. The girl seemed happy to hear that, however, as she clapped her hands and leaned forward towards him. Another outsider. That's wonderful, she exclaimed happily. Naruto quickly glanced about to make sure there weren't any guards about to overhear her. Traffic was strictly controlled between the villages of Wave Country, which would heap unwanted scrutiny on his team. Where from? Ishiyama? Bofu? Her eyes actually seemed about to shoot glitter from the way they sparkled, to his alarm. Not Hamura. Naruto blinked at all the names. Were those towns? Crap, what a time to remember he'd glossed over the briefing packet. Picking a town at random, he tried to go for the safe bet. Bofu, actually, he half stated, half asked. To his relief, the girl deflated. Not much better than here, then, she said, looking a little downcast. I heard the dikes there broke last week. I'm sorry, she apologized with a meek bow. Naruto wanted to scream. This girl was really testing his cover, and he was honestly pulling whatever answers he had out of his ass. Area hit sucked. He glanced at the store Hikari was inside of. An idea bloomed. Actually, we're here to pick up some supplies for the wounded. Technically not false, but also not quite true. Just the way Shinobi liked it. Guess those lessons with Hikari on subtlety had paid off. Now, however, it was time to turn the tables or get the hell out of Dodge. Any more prodding, and Naruto wasn't sure his cover would hold. And you? He asked curiously. The girl cocked her head to the side and smiled down at him. I'm on my way to the forest, to pick some flowers. Naruto grinned. Nice. A present? He asked teasingly. The girl blushed a bit before shaking her head. Medicine, she said, a little abashed. A friend of mine got hurt, so I'm helping him recover. Naruto looked at her quizzically. How are flowers going to do that? Does he like looking at them? Are they special flowers that heal you by smelling? The girl stared at him for a while, unsure whether he was pulling her leg or not. Giving Naruto the benefit of the doubt, she shook her head with an amused smile. I grind the flowers to make a paste, and that paste has healing properties, she clarified. Huh, grunted Naruto as he glanced at the line of people still waiting to be served. Hikari had been inside for like 10 minutes already. How long was this going to take? I wonder why Nechan didn't do that. The girl giggled melodiously, prompting an involuntary blush from Naruto. It's a very complicated art, she told him amusedly. Not everyone can do it without practice. Naruto nodded in comprehension and grinned at the older girl. I'm sure your friend will appreciate it then, Nei-san, he told her earnestly before smirking mischievously and nudging her in the side. Maybe he'd agree to a date, afterward, he teased. The girl reddened a bit before giggling. I doubt it, she told him, somewhat mysteriously. Oi, Brad, we're done here, both of them heard a woman yelling from within the store. Naruto's ears perked up, something that didn't go unnoticed by the girl. You're Nei-chan? She asked. Naruto nodded. Yeah. Time to go back, I guess, he said, a little disappointed. He held out his hand to the girl. I'm Naruto, he introduced himself, remembering not to offer up his last name. The girl smiled and accepted his offered hand, shaking it once. Haku, she said with a smile. I hope your friends back home get better, Naruto-san. And I'm glad you're looking out for your precious people, she said. Naruto grinned. Yeah, same to you, Haku-chan. The girl blinked at him before grinning mischievously as she turned and walked away. After a few steps, she turned around and smiled at him. By the way, I'm a boy, she informed him before walking away, leaving Naruto gaping. That's how Hikari found him moments later, prompting her to look at him askance as he stared at an empty patch of road. What the hell happened to you? Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and share. Want early audio-only versions? Join me on Patreon, link in description. I'm Fox Sage, see you next time.